Margaret Rose Sullivan clutched her worn leather suitcase with trembling fingers as the steam locomotive's whistle pierced the desert air one final time. The train that had carried her across 3 states was now disappearing into the shimmering heat waves of the Arizona Territory, taking with it the last connection to everything she had ever known. Her husband of 12 years had abandoned her at this desolate railway station with nothing but $17, a change of clothes, and the crushing weight of his final words still echoing in her ears. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had begun like any other Tuesday in their modest home in St. Louis, Missouri. Margaret Rose had prepared breakfast for her husband, Kenneth Sullivan, as she had done every day since their wedding in 1881. The bacon sizzled in the cast-iron skillet while she hummed softly, unaware that this would be the last meal she would ever cook in the kitchen where she had spent the happiest years of her life. Kenneth sat at their small wooden table, his newspaper creating a barrier between them as he consumed his eggs and toast in silence. Margaret Rose had grown accustomed to his distant behavior over the past 2 years, attributing it to the pressures of his work at the textile mill and the financial struggles that had plagued their household since the economic downturn. She had gained considerable weight during their marriage, her once slender frame now carrying the evidence of countless lonely evenings filled with comfort food and the gradual abandonment of hope for the children they had never been able to conceive. At 34 years old, Margaret Rose had accepted that her dreams of motherhood would remain unfulfilled, but she had clung to the belief that her marriage, though strained, still held the foundation of mutual respect and shared history that could weather any storm. She had been tragically mistaken. The conversation that shattered her world had been delivered with the casual cruelty of someone discussing the weather. Kenneth folded his newspaper with deliberate precision, cleared his throat, and announced that he had purchased train tickets for a journey west. Margaret Rose's initial excitement at the prospect of adventure and a fresh start in new territory was quickly crushed when Kenneth clarified that only one ticket bore a return date. "I found employment opportunities in California," Kenneth had said, his eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond her left shoulder. "The position requires a man of particular qualifications and social standing. I'll be expected to attend business functions, represent the company at various social gatherings. It's a chance for advancement that could secure our financial future." Margaret Rose had felt the first stirrings of unease as Kenneth's explanation continued, noting how he avoided direct eye contact and seemed to be reciting a rehearsed speech rather than engaging in genuine conversation with his wife. "That sounds wonderful," she had replied, already mentally cataloging which of their possessions could be sold to fund the journey and which could be packed for their new life together. "When do we leave?" The silence that followed her question stretched like a chasm between them, filled with unspoken truths that Margaret Rose's trusting heart was not yet prepared to comprehend. Kenneth's face had taken on the expression of a man preparing to deliver news of a death in the family, which, in a sense, he was. "Margaret Rose," he had said, finally meeting her gaze with eyes that held no warmth, no affection, no trace of the young man who had courted her with such passionate intensity 13 years earlier. "You won't be continuing to California with me. The journey ends for you in Arizona Territory." The words had struck her like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of complete betrayal. Margaret Rose had felt her world tilting on its axis as Kenneth explained, with businesslike efficiency, that he had accepted a position with a manufacturing company whose social expectations did not accommodate wives of her current circumstances. "My supervisor has made it clear that success in this position depends on maintaining a certain image," Kenneth had continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his justification. "Business dinners, social events, networking opportunities. with potential investors. I need a wife who can represent our family appropriately in those circles. Margaret Rose had stared at her husband in stunned silence as the full implications of his statement settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Kenneth was not simply leaving her behind temporarily while he established himself in a new location. He was abandoning her entirely, trading their marriage for the possibility of social and financial advancement that her appearance would allegedly prevent him from achieving. "You're leaving me," she had whispered, the words barely audible above the sound of her heart breaking. "After 12 years of marriage, you're simply leaving me." Kenneth's response had revealed the depth of his selfishness and the calculated nature of his betrayal. He produced a stack of legal documents from his coat pocket, papers that he had clearly prepared well in advance of this conversation. The dissolution of their marriage had been planned with the same methodical attention to detail that Kenneth brought to his work at the textile mill. "I've made arrangements," he had said, spreading the documents across their breakfast table like a merchant displaying his wares. "There's a boarding house in Tucson where you can stay temporarily. The proprietor, Mrs. Martha Whitman, has been paid for 6 months' lodging in advance. That should give you sufficient time to find employment and establish yourself independently." Margaret Rose had felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up from somewhere deep in her chest as she processed the absurdity of Kenneth's careful planning. He had researched boarding houses, negotiated rates, and made financial arrangements for her abandonment with the same thoroughness he might have applied to purchasing livestock or arranging for home repairs. And then what? She had asked, her voice gaining strength as anger began to compete with shock and grief. "What happens after 6 months when your advance payment runs out? What happens when I'm alone in a territory where I know no one, have no family, no connections, no means of support?" Kenneth had shrugged with the indifference of a man discussing someone else's problems. "You'll find work. There are always opportunities. For women willing to take on domestic service, laundry work, seamstress duties. You're capable and intelligent, Margaret Rose. You'll manage." The casual dismissal of her future welfare had cut deeper than any of his previous statements. Kenneth was not simply leaving her. He was consigning her to a life of servitude and poverty while he pursued his own ambitions with a clear conscience. The man who had promised to love and protect her until death had become a stranger, willing to sacrifice her well-being for his own advancement. Margaret Rose had spent the remainder of that morning in a state of numb shock, mechanically packing her few possessions while Kenneth conducted his affairs with the efficient satisfaction of a man tying up loose ends. He had sold their furniture to neighbors, settled accounts with local merchants, and arranged for the transfer of their modest savings to a bank account that bore only his name. The journey from St. Louis to Tucson had been a nightmare of humiliation and dawning realization. Kenneth had maintained the pretense of marital civility during the portions of the trip when they were observed by other passengers, but his behavior had grown increasingly cold and dismissive as they traveled further from anyone who might know them or judge his conduct. He had spoken to Margaret Rose only when necessary, treating her with the impersonal courtesy he might have shown to a traveling companion who had outlived her usefulness. She had watched him charm fellow passengers with stories of his bright future in California, his voice animated with enthusiasm that never extended to discussions of his wife's circumstances. The final indignity had come when the train reached Tucson Station. Kenneth had removed Margaret Rose's suitcase from the luggage car with brisk efficiency, set it on the wooden platform beside her, and pressed $17 into her palm with the air of a charitable gentleman assisting a stranger in distress. "This should cover your immediate expenses until you can make other arrangements," he had said, his tone suggesting that he considered this gesture generous rather than the bare minimum required by basic human decency. Margaret Rose had stood frozen on the platform, watching her husband of 12 years board the train that would carry him to his new life without her. He had not looked back, had not offered any final words of affection or regret, had not acknowledged that he was abandoning a woman who had devoted her adult life to their marriage. As the train had disappeared into the desert heat, Margaret Rose had felt the full weight of her situation settling around her like prison walls. She was alone in a territory where she knew no one, possessed no connections, and had no means of supporting herself beyond the $17 Kenneth had provided as severance pay for 12 years of marriage. The boarding house Mrs. Martha Whitman operated was exactly what Margaret Rose had expected, based on Kenneth's pragmatic approach to her abandonment. The establishment was clean, respectable, and completely devoid of warmth or character. Mrs. Whitman herself was a stern woman in her 60s, who managed her business with military precision and showed no curiosity about the circumstances that had brought Margaret Rose to her establishment. Room and board are paid through March, Mrs. Whitman had informed Margaret Rose as she showed her to a small chamber on the second floor. Meals are served at 6, 12, and 6. No visitors after 9 o'clock. Laundry is done on Mondays and Thursdays. Any questions? Margaret Rose had shaken her head, understanding that Mrs. Whitman's brusque efficiency was probably kindness in its own way. The older woman was providing a service without judgment or intrusive inquiries, which was more than Margaret Rose had any right to expect from strangers. The room was furnished with the bare essentials: a narrow bed, a washstand, a small chest of drawers, and a single wooden chair. The window looked out over Tucson's main street, where Margaret Rose could observe the daily rhythms of a frontier town that bore no resemblance to the established communities of the Midwest, where she had spent her entire life. During her first week at the boarding house, Margaret Rose had ventured out only for essential errands, purchasing basic supplies and familiarizing herself with the layout of the town, where she would apparently be spending the foreseeable future. Tucson in 1893 was a community in transition, balancing between its frontier origins and aspirations towards civilization and respectability. The streets were a mixture of established businesses and temporary structures, reflecting the optimism of settlers who believed that the railroad's arrival would transform their desert outpost into a thriving commercial center. Mexican influences were evident everywhere, from the architectural styles to the languages heard in the marketplace, creating a cultural complexity that both fascinated and intimidated Margaret Rose. She had made tentative inquiries about employment opportunities, visiting the establishments that seemed most likely to need domestic help or seamstress services. The responses had been politely discouraging. Most business owners were reluctant to hire a woman whose circumstances they didn't understand, particularly one whose appearance suggested that she had not been accustomed to physical labor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret Rose's weight, which Kenneth had cited as one of the primary reasons for her abandonment, proved to be an additional obstacle in securing employment. Potential employers seemed to associate her size with laziness or poor health, despite her protestations that she was strong, capable, and desperate for work. The rejection that had cut deepest came from Mrs. Adelaide Foster, who operated a boarding house that catered to more affluent travelers and permanent residents. Mrs. Foster had examined Margaret Rose with the critical eye of someone evaluating livestock before delivering her verdict with brutal honesty. "I'm sure you're a nice enough woman," Mrs. Foster had said, "but my establishment caters to a particular clientele. My guests expect to be served by staff who reflect the establishment's standards of refinement and presentation. I'm afraid you wouldn't be suitable for the position." Margaret Rose had left that interview with burning cheeks and the growing realization that her physical appearance would be a barrier to employment that extended far beyond Kenneth's shallow social climbing. She was trapped in a society that judged women's worth based on their ability to conform to narrow standards of attractiveness and respectability. As her first month in Tucson drew to a close, Margaret Rose had found herself facing the prospect of genuine destitution. Her $17 had dwindled to less than $3. Her inquiries about employment had yielded nothing but polite rejections, and the weight of her isolation was becoming almost unbearable. She had begun taking long walks through the desert, surrounding Tucson, partly to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the boarding house and partly because the stark beauty of the landscape provided a kind of solace that human company had failed to offer. The vast expanse of sky and sand spoke to something in her soul that had been crushed by Kenneth's betrayal and society's subsequent rejection. It was during one of these solitary desert walks that Margaret Rose's life would change forever, though she had no way of knowing it as she picked her way carefully through the sagebrush and cactus that defined the Arizona Territory's harsh beauty. The sun was beginning to set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that made even her desperate circumstances seem touched by divine beauty. She had paused to rest in the shade of a large boulder, removing her worn boots to massage feet that had grown soft during her years of domestic life in St. Louis. The silence of the desert was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the whisper of wind through the sparse vegetation. Margaret Rose had closed her eyes and allowed herself to imagine, for just a moment, what it might feel like to simply disappear into this vast wilderness, to let the desert claim her and end the humiliation and struggle that had become her daily existence. The thought was not entirely unwelcome, given the bleakness of her prospects and the complete absence of anyone who might mourn her passing. It was in this moment of deepest despair that fate intervened in the form of 3 Apache warriors who materialized from the desert landscape, as if conjured from the earth itself. The 3 Apache warriors emerged from the desert landscape with the fluid grace of predators who had spent lifetimes moving through terrain that would challenge even the most experienced frontiersmen. Margaret Rose's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the boulder, her mind racing through fragments of terrifying stories she had heard about Apache raids and the fate that befell white settlers who found themselves alone and defenseless in the territory. The leader of the group was a man who commanded attention through sheer presence rather than dramatic gestures. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulder-length black hair adorned with eagle feathers and a face that spoke of both wisdom and strength, he moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the lives of many. His dark eyes swept the area with practiced efficiency before settling on Margaret Rose's huddled form. She had expected violence, capture, or worse based on the lurid tales that circulated among white settlers about Apache brutality. Instead, the tall warrior raised his hand in what appeared to be a gesture of peace, speaking quietly to his companions in their native language before approaching Margaret Rose with careful, non-threatening movements. "You are far from your people," he said in accented but perfectly comprehensible English, his voice carrying the deep resonance of someone accustomed to addressing large gatherings. "The desert is dangerous for those who do not understand its ways." Margaret Rose found her voice despite her terror, pride compelling her to meet his gaze directly, even as her hands trembled. "I'm not lost," she managed to say, though the statement was only technically accurate. "I was simply taking a walk." The Apache leader studied her with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance and circumstances. He noticed her worn clothing, her inappropriate footwear for desert travel, the way she held herself with the careful dignity of someone trying to maintain composure, despite desperate circumstances. "A walk that brings you many miles from the town," he observed, settling onto his heels with the easy grace of someone equally comfortable standing or sitting. "With feet that bleed through thin shoes and a face that speaks of great sorrow." The accuracy of his assessment struck Margaret Rose like a physical blow. She had indeed walked much farther than she had realized, following deer paths and dry creek beds until the lights of Tucson had disappeared behind her. Her feet were indeed bleeding, her emotions were indeed written across her features, and his perception cut through her carefully maintained pretense with surgical precision. My name is Running Bear, the Apache leader continued, apparently deciding that formal introductions were appropriate despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting. These are my brothers, Swift Arrow and Standing Wolf. We hunt deer in this place, but instead we find a white woman who sits alone in the desert as the sun dies. Margaret Rose realized that protocol demanded she reciprocate his courtesy, even though every instinct screamed at her to flee from men whose people were considered mortal enemies by the white settlers who had invaded their ancestral lands. I am Margaret Rose Sullivan, she replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. I live in Tucson. At least temporarily. Running Bear's expression suggested that he had caught the significance of her qualification. Temporarily, he repeated. Thoughtfully, this suggests that your situation is uncertain. The kindness in his tone proved to be Margaret Rose's undoing. After weeks of rejection, hostility, and indifference from the white community that should have welcomed her, this Apache warrior's gentle inquiry about her welfare broke through the defensive walls she had constructed around her emotions. Tears began streaming down her cheeks as months of suppressed grief and terror finally found release. She told Running Bear everything, the words pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. She spoke of Kenneth's betrayal, the calculated cruelty of his abandonment, her failed attempts to find employment, and the growing certainty that she would soon be destitute and homeless in a territory where she had no connections or support. Running Bear listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave as Margaret Rose's story unfolded. His companions, Swift Arrow and Standing Wolf, had initially maintained the alert posture of warriors ready for potential danger, but as they recognized the nature of the encounter, they relaxed into positions that suggested they were prepared to wait as long as necessary for their leader to complete this unexpected counsel. This man who was your husband, Running Bear said when Margaret Rose's narrative finally exhausted itself. He abandoned you as a warrior might abandon a horse that has gone lame, but a horse that is lame can heal. A woman who has been betrayed by her protector has suffered a wound that goes much deeper. The comparison struck Margaret Rose as both accurate and strangely comforting. Running Bear understood that Kenneth's abandonment represented more than mere rejection. It was a fundamental violation of the trust and protection that should have characterized their marriage bond. Among my people, Running Bear continued, a man who abandons his woman brings shame upon his entire family. His actions reflect not only his own weakness, but the failure of his relatives to teach him proper respect for those who depend on his strength and wisdom. Margaret Rose found herself fascinated by this perspective, which stood in stark contrast to the attitude she had encountered in Tucson. The white community had treated her abandonment as evidence of her own inadequacy, assuming that Kenneth must have had valid reasons for his actions. Running Bear, however, viewed Kenneth's behavior as a moral failing that reflected poorly on his character and upbringing. In your world, Margaret Rose said hesitantly, what happens to women who find themselves in situations like mine? Running Bear's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine compassion. In our world, such a woman would be welcomed into the family of her husband's relatives, who would provide for her needs and ensure her safety. If she had no such relatives, other families would compete for the honor of caring for her, recognizing that her welfare reflected the strength and generosity of the entire community. The contrast between Apache social customs and the harsh individualism of white frontier society could not have been more striking. Margaret Rose had spent weeks being evaluated as a potential economic burden by people who measured human worth, primarily in terms of productivity and self-sufficiency. Running Bear spoke of a culture where caring for vulnerable community members was considered an honor rather than an obligation. But I am not of your people, Margaret Rose pointed out, though she found herself wishing that circumstances could somehow make such protection possible. No, Running Bear agreed, but you are a woman who has been wronged by one who should have protected you. This makes you deserving of consideration regardless of the color of your skin or the customs of your birth. As the conversation continued, Margaret Rose learned that Running Bear was not simply a warrior, but the leader of a small band of Apache families who had managed to avoid forced relocation to the reservations that confined most of their people. They lived in hidden canyon settlements, maintaining traditional ways while adapting carefully to the changing realities of territorial politics. Running Bear explained that his group survived through a combination of hunting, limited trading with sympathetic Mexican merchants, and the kind of cautious mobility that kept them ahead of both military patrols and bounty hunters who profited from capturing Apache families for delivery to reservation authorities. "We are not many," he said, "but we are free. We follow the old ways, honor the spirits of our ancestors, and raise our children to understand both the wisdom of tradition and the necessity of adaptation." The picture he painted was one of a community under constant pressure but determined to maintain its cultural identity and independence. Margaret Rose found herself admiring the courage required to live such a precarious existence, particularly when contrasted with her own paralysis in the face of much less dramatic challenges. As darkness settled over the desert, Running Bear made an offer that would alter the entire trajectory of Margaret Rose's life. "You cannot return to the town in darkness," he said practically. "The desert holds many dangers for those who travel alone at night. You will come with us to our camp. Rest safely, and tomorrow we will ensure that you reach Tucson without harm." Margaret Rose understood that accepting this invitation would mean trusting her safety to men whom white society considered savage enemies. Yet she also recognized that Running Bear and his companions had shown her more genuine kindness and concern than anyone in Tucson had demonstrated during her entire residence there. "You would do this for a stranger?" she asked, genuinely puzzled by such generosity. "We would do this for anyone who needed help," Running Bear replied simply. "But you are not quite a stranger now. You have shared your pain with us, and in doing so you have created bonds that carry obligations." The journey to Running Bear's camp took nearly 2 hours, following paths that were invisible to Margaret Rose's untrained eyes, but clearly familiar to her guides. They traveled through a landscape of stunning beauty, with moonlight transforming the desert into a silver wonderland that bore no resemblance to the harsh, forbidding terrain she had experienced during daylight hours. Running Bear maintained a steady conversation during their travel, pointing out landmarks, explaining the practical uses of various desert plants, and sharing stories about Apache history and culture that revealed the depth of his education and intelligence. Margaret Rose found herself fascinated by his perspectives on territorial politics, tribal traditions, and the complex negotiations required to maintain his people's freedom. "You speak English remarkably well," she observed during a rest stop beside a small spring that provided clear, cold water in the midst of apparent desolation. "I attended the mission school at San Carlos for 3 years, Running Bear explained, his tone suggesting mixed feelings about that experience. "The priests believed that education would make us better Christians and more compliant reservation inhabitants. Instead, it taught me to understand the thinking of white officials and gave me tools that served my people's independence." Margaret Rose realized that she was dealing with a man whose intellectual capabilities had been seriously underestimated by the white authorities who sought to control his people. Running Bear had taken the education offered by his captors and transformed it into an instrument of resistance rather than assimilation. The Apache camp, when they finally reached it, proved to be far more sophisticated than Margaret Rose had expected based on the crude stereotypes that circulated among white settlers. Hidden in a box canyon that provided natural protection from observation and attack, the settlement consisted of carefully constructed wickiups arranged according to patterns that reflected both practical considerations and cultural traditions. Children played quiet games around carefully banked fires, while women worked on tasks that ranged from food preparation to the creation of baskets and clothing of remarkable beauty and craftsmanship. Men maintained weapons and tools with the meticulous attention to detail that meant the difference between survival and death in their precarious existence. What struck Margaret Rose most powerfully was the sense of community that permeated every aspect of camp life. Despite the obvious hardships and dangers that defined their daily existence, these people had created an environment of mutual support and shared responsibility that contrasted sharply with the competitive individualism she had encountered in white frontier society. Running Bear introduced Margaret Rose to his extended family, including his wife Morning Star, a woman of quiet dignity whose immediate acceptance of the unexpected guest spoke to the cultural values that Running Bear had described earlier. Morning Star prepared food for Margaret Rose, provided clean water for washing, and arranged sleeping accommodations without any suggestion that such hospitality was unusual or burdensome. "She does not speak English," Running Bear explained as Morning Star settled a soft blanket around Margaret Rose's shoulders, "but she understands that you are far from home and in need of comfort." Margaret Rose found herself moved to tears once again by this simple act of human kindness. Morning Star's gentle ministrations reminded her of the maternal care she had not experienced since her own mother's death many years earlier. The Apache woman's acceptance was complete and unquestioning, based not on Margaret Rose's social status or economic potential, but simply on her need for assistance. As the evening progressed, Margaret Rose observed the complex social dynamics that governed camp life. Decisions were made through consultation and consensus rather than authoritarian decree, with women's voices carrying equal weight in discussions that affected the community's welfare. Children were taught through patient instruction rather than harsh discipline, and elderly members were treated with reverence rather than being viewed as burdens. "Your people live very differently than mine," Margaret Rose observed to Running Bear as they sat beside the central fire, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "Different, yes," Running Bear agreed, "but perhaps not so different in the things that matter most. We value loyalty, courage, wisdom, and compassion. We believe that the strong should protect the weak, that knowledge should be shared, and that every person has gifts that benefit the entire community." Margaret Rose reflected on these values, recognizing how rarely they were practiced in the white society that had rejected her so thoroughly. Kenneth's abandonment would have been viewed as shameful cowardice by Apache standards, while her own desperate circumstances would have mobilized the entire community to provide assistance and support. "What will happen to me?" she asked quietly, voicing the question that had haunted her since Kenneth's betrayal. "I have nowhere to go, no way to support myself, no family to turn to for help." Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames with the expression of a man weighing possibilities and consequences. When he finally spoke, his words would echo in Margaret Rose's memory for the rest of her life. "You will never be alone again," he said with quiet certainty. "This I promise you." Dawn arrived in the Apache camp with a symphony of desert sounds that Margaret Rose had never experienced during her sheltered life in St. Louis. The haunting call of coyotes gave way to the gentle rustle of awakening families, the soft murmur of morning prayers, and the crackling of fires being rekindled to prepare the first meal of the day. She awakened on a bed of soft furs and woven blankets, more comfortable than she had been since leaving Missouri, surrounded by the alien yet somehow familiar rhythms of a community that had welcomed her without question or judgment. Morning Star appeared beside her sleeping area carrying a clay vessel filled with warm water scented with desert herbs, along with clean cloth for washing. The Apache woman's movements were economical and graceful, speaking of a lifetime spent managing household tasks under conditions that demanded efficiency and careful use of resources. She smiled at Margaret Rose with genuine warmth, communicating through gestures and expressions what language barriers made impossible to convey with words. Margaret Rose found herself studying Morningstar's face, noting the laugh lines around her dark eyes and the calloused hands that spoke of constant work, yet also the serene dignity that characterized her every movement. This was a woman who had found contentment and purpose within circumstances that white society would consider primitive and harsh. The contrast with Margaret Rose's own dissatisfaction and desperation could not have been more striking. As Margaret Rose performed her morning ablutions, she became aware of the complex choreography that governed camp life. Children helped with age-appropriate tasks while adults managed the more demanding responsibilities of food preparation, equipment maintenance, and the constant vigilance required to ensure the community's safety. Everyone seemed to understand their role without need for explicit direction, suggesting a social organization based on mutual understanding rather than rigid hierarchy. Running Bear approached as Margaret Rose was attempting to arrange her hair into some semblance of respectability using the small mirror she carried in her traveling bag. His expression was thoughtful, as if he had spent the night considering problems that required careful solution. "You slept well?" he asked, settling beside the fire where Morningstar was preparing a meal of corn cakes, dried meat, and a tea brewed from desert plants that Margaret Rose could not identify. "Better than I have in weeks," Margaret Rose replied honestly. "Your wife has shown me extraordinary kindness." "Morningstar sees what I see," Running Bear said, accepting a wooden bowl from his wife with a nod of gratitude. "A woman of strength, who has been wounded by circumstances beyond her control, but whose spirit remains unbroken." Margaret Rose felt tears threatening again at this assessment. She had begun to think of herself as fundamentally damaged, a failure whose own inadequacies had contributed to Kenneth's abandonment. Running Bear's perspective suggested alternative interpretations of her situation that she had not considered. "I must return to Tucson today," she said reluctantly, recognizing that her temporary refuge could not become a permanent solution. "Mrs. Whitman will be expecting me, and I still need to find employment before my lodging payment expires." Running Bear's expression grew troubled, and he exchanged a meaningful glance with Morningstar before responding. "You will return to a town where people have already decided that you have nothing of value to offer them. You will search for work among those who judge women by their ability to serve male desires rather than their intelligence or character. You will grow thinner from worry and poor food until you become desperate enough to accept any arrangement that offers survival." The accuracy of his prediction struck Margaret Rose like a physical blow because she recognized the truth in every word. Her brief experience in Tucson had already demonstrated the hostile reception that awaited a woman in her circumstances. Returning to that environment would mean accepting a gradual descent into desperation and degradation. "What alternative do I have?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew what Running Bear was preparing to suggest. "You could remain here," he said simply. "You could become part of our community, contribute your skills to our survival, and find the acceptance that your own people have denied you." The proposal was simultaneously attractive and terrifying. Margaret Rose had experienced more genuine kindness and respect during her single night in the Apache camp than during her entire residence in Tucson. Yet the implications of such a choice extended far beyond personal comfort and safety. "I would be abandoning everything that defines who I am," she said slowly. "My culture, my identity, my connection to the world I was born into." "Would you be abandoning these things?" Running Bear asked gently. "Or would you be choosing to become someone new? Someone who is valued for her true qualities, rather than judged by standards that were created to exclude and diminish her?" Margaret Rose spent the morning walking through the camp, observing the daily activities that sustained this small community in their precarious freedom. She watched women weaving baskets of extraordinary beauty and utility, their hands moving with practiced skill as they transformed desert plants into containers that could hold water, store food, or serve ceremonial purposes. The work was both practical and artistic, reflecting values that integrated beauty with functionality. She observed men crafting weapons and tools with meticulous attention to detail, each arrow shaft perfectly balanced, each knife edge honed to razor sharpness. These were not the crude implements she had expected based on white stereotypes of Apache material culture, but sophisticated tools that represented generations of accumulated knowledge and refined technique. The children fascinated her most of all. They played games that taught hunting skills, storytelling, and social cooperation, while adults guided their learning with patient instruction rather than harsh discipline. Boys and girls received equal attention and encouragement, with individual talents being recognized and nurtured regardless of gender expectations. Our children learn to think for themselves while understanding their responsibilities to the community, explained Wise Owl, an elderly woman whose English had been learned through decades of trading relationships with Mexican merchants. They are taught that intelligence and courage are more valuable than obedience to arbitrary authority. Margaret Rose found herself contrasting this educational philosophy with her own childhood experiences, where conformity and submission had been valued above creativity or independent thought. She had been raised to please others rather than to develop her own capabilities, preparing her perfectly for the kind of dependent relationship that had made Kenneth's abandonment so devastating. In your world, Wise Owl continued, women are taught to find their value through men's approval. Here, women know their worth comes from their contributions to the life of the people. A woman who can heal sickness, solve problems, or create beauty is honored regardless of whether men find her attractive. The conversation crystallized thoughts that had been forming in Margaret Rose's mind since her arrival at the camp. Apache society offered not just refuge from her immediate circumstances, but an entirely different framework for understanding women's roles and possibilities. She could become someone new, someone whose worth was measured by different standards than those that had condemned her to failure in white society, yet the choice also represented a form of death. Margaret Rose Sullivan, the Missouri-born wife, who had tried so desperately to please her husband and conform to social expectations, would cease to exist. In her place would emerge someone else, a woman whose identity was shaped by Apache values and Apache community needs. Running Bear found her beside the stream that provided the camp's water supply, where she had been sitting in contemplation for nearly an hour. The desert landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and harsh in its indifference to human struggles and aspirations. "You are thinking deeply about difficult questions," he observed, settling beside her on a sun-warmed boulder. "I'm thinking about what it means to choose between two different ways of being human," Margaret Rose replied. "In my world, I have failed according to every measure that matters. In yours, I might find success, but only by becoming someone completely different from who I have always been." Running Bear nodded understanding. "When I was young, I believed that a man could only be Apache or white, that these were separate paths that never touched. The mission school taught me different lessons. I learned that wisdom comes from understanding many ways of seeing the world, then choosing what serves life and growth." "But you remained Apache," Margaret Rose pointed out. "I remained Apache because Apache ways serve my people's needs," Running Bear corrected gently. "But I also use knowledge gained from white education, Mexican trading customs, and observation of other tribal traditions. A wise person takes what is useful and leaves what is harmful, regardless of where such knowledge originates." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Swift Arrow, who approached with the urgency of someone bearing important news. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his words causing Running Bear's expression to grow grave. Margaret Rose understood. None of the language, but the tension in both men's postures suggested serious problems. "There are soldiers in the valley below," Running Bear explained after Swift Arrow finished his report. "A patrol searching for our camp. Someone in Tucson has told them about tracks leading into the desert, and they believe we have taken a white woman captive. The irony of the situation struck Margaret Rose immediately. Her voluntary presence in the Apache camp was being interpreted as kidnapping by authorities who could not imagine that a white woman might choose Apache society over their own. The misunderstanding threatened to destroy the very community that had offered her sanctuary. "I must return immediately," she said, rising from the boulder with sudden determination. "If I go back to Tucson and appear unharmed, the soldiers will have no reason to continue searching for your camp." Running Bear studied her face carefully, noting the resolution in her eyes. "And then what will happen to you? You will be back where you started, facing the same impossible situation that brought you to the desert in despair." "Perhaps," Margaret Rose admitted, "but I will not be responsible for bringing danger to people who have shown me nothing but kindness." The discussion that followed involved the entire adult population of the camp, as Running Bear called a council to address the crisis that Margaret Rose's presence had inadvertently created. She listened to discussions conducted in Apache, understanding nothing of the words, but recognizing the serious consideration being given to various alternatives. Morning Star approached during a pause in the formal deliberations, taking Margaret Rose's hands in her own while speaking earnestly in Apache. Though the language was incomprehensible, the emotion behind the words was unmistakable. Morning Star was pleading with Margaret Rose not to sacrifice herself for the community's safety. "She says that you have become her sister," Running Bear translated. "She says that sisters do not abandon each other when trouble comes. They face difficulties together." The simple declaration broke Margaret Rose's heart because it represented the kind of family bond she had never experienced, even during her marriage to Kenneth. Morning Star was claiming kinship based on affection and choice rather than blood or legal obligation, offering the unconditional loyalty that Margaret Rose had spent her entire life seeking. "Tell her that I cherish her friendship," Margaret Rose replied, "but I cannot allow my problems to become her people's problems." The council reached a decision after nearly 2 hours of discussion. Running Bear would escort Margaret Rose back toward Tucson, but not directly to the town. Instead, they would create evidence that she had become lost in the desert and been found by a Mexican trader who was returning her to safety. This would explain her absence while avoiding any suggestion that she had been in contact with Apache bands. "And after that?" Margaret Rose asked, recognizing that this solution addressed the immediate crisis without resolving her underlying problems. "After that, you must choose," Running Bear said gravely. "You can continue trying to build a life among people who have already decided you have nothing valuable to offer them. Or you can trust that there are other ways to find meaning and purpose in this world." The journey back toward Tucson required most of the day, following routes that would support the cover story Running Bear had devised. They traveled in silence for long stretches, both understanding that they were approaching a parting that might be permanent. Margaret Rose found herself memorizing details of the desert landscape, the play of light on distant mountains, subtle beauty of plants that thrived in conditions that would kill more delicate species. "You spoke of becoming someone new," she said, as they paused to rest during the afternoon heat. "What did you mean exactly?" Running Bear smiled, recognizing the question as evidence that Margaret Rose was still considering alternatives to returning to her previous life. "I meant that you could choose to define yourself by your own values rather than others' expectations. You could decide what kind of woman you want to be and then become that person, regardless of whether such a choice fits CONVENTIONL patterns. Would such a choice require living with your people?" "Not necessarily," Running Bear replied thoughtfully. "But it would require courage to reject the judgments that have been made about you and wisdom to recognize your own worth. These qualities could serve you anywhere, among any people." As evening approached, they reached the predetermined location where Margaret Rose would wait to be discovered by the Mexican trader, who was part of Running Bear's elaborate deception. The man, introduced as Carlos Mendoza, was a weathered individual whose extensive trading relationships had made him valuable to Apache bands, seeking to obtain supplies without direct contact with white authorities. "Senora," Carlos said in heavily accented English, "I am told you have been wandering in the desert. This is very dangerous. You are fortunate to be alive." The charade felt strange to Margaret Rose, but she recognized its necessity. Carlos would take her to the outskirts of Tucson and deliver her to authorities with a story that explained her absence without compromising the Apache camp's security. She would be returned to exactly the same circumstances she had fled, but with new knowledge about alternatives that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional society. Running Bear's farewell was brief but meaningful. "Remember what I told you," he said quietly. "You will never be alone again. This is true whether you choose to return to us or find another path forward. You have learned that there are people in this world who value what you have to offer. That knowledge changes everything, even if you never see us again." As Carlos's wagon carried her toward the lights of Tucson, Margaret Rose felt as if she were leaving one world and reluctantly returning to another. The choice Running Bear had offered remained open to her, but acting on it would require courage she was not certain she possessed. The safe path led back to Mrs. Whitman's boarding house and the gradual descent into desperation she had been facing before her desert encounter. The dangerous path led toward an uncertain future that promised meaning and acceptance at the cost of everything familiar and conventional in her life. Margaret Rose's return to Tucson created a sensation that far exceeded her expectations or desires. Carlos Mendoza delivered her to the sheriff's office just as the sun was setting, his carefully rehearsed story of finding a lost white woman in the desert spreading through the small frontier community like wildfire. Within an hour, curious townspeople had gathered outside the building, eager to hear first-hand accounts of her supposed ordeal and survival in Apache territory. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford was a lean man in his 50s whose weathered face spoke of decades spent mediating between the competing interests of settlers, territorial authorities, and the various tribal groups that still maintained a presence in the region. His gray eyes studied Margaret Rose with the careful attention of someone accustomed to distinguishing truth from deception in the stories brought to his office. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat in the chair across from his desk, "Carlos here tells me he found you wandering about 10 miles southeast of town, suffering from exposure and dehydration. Says you told him you'd been lost for 2 days after taking a walk that went longer than planned." Margaret Rose nodded, maintaining the composed demeanor she had practiced during the wagon ride into town. "I'm embarrassed to admit that I seriously underestimated the challenges of desert travel. I thought I was following a clear path back to town, but I became disoriented when darkness fell." Sheriff Crawford made notes on a piece of paper, his expression suggesting skepticism about certain aspects of her account. "Mighty fortunate that Carlos happened to be in that particular area. The desert's a big place, and there's plenty of folks who've wandered off and never been seen again." "I'm very grateful for his assistance," Margaret Rose replied, recognizing that the sheriff was probing for inconsistencies in their story. "I don't know what would have happened to me if he hadn't come along when he did." The questioning continued for nearly an hour, with Sheriff Crawford asking detailed questions about her route, the landmarks she remembered, and her condition when Carlos found her. Margaret Rose answered as honestly as possible within the constraints of the deception, drawing on her actual desert experience while omitting any reference to the Apache camp or its inhabitants. "Strange thing is," Sheriff Crawford said eventually, "we had reports of Apache sign in that same general area. A patrol went out yesterday looking for evidence of hostile activity, but they didn't find anything conclusive. You didn't happen to see any Indians during your wandering, did you?" Margaret Rose felt her heart racing, but managed to maintain her composure. I saw no one until Carlos found me. I was focused entirely on finding water and shelter from the sun. Sheriff Crawford studied her face for several more seconds before apparently deciding that her story, while perhaps incomplete, posed no threat to community safety. "Well, Mrs. Sullivan, you're a lucky woman. The desert doesn't often give folks second chances when they make mistakes like that." Mrs. Whitman arrived at the sheriff's office just as Margaret Rose was being released, her expression combining relief with the kind of stern disapproval that suggested lectures would follow once they returned to the boarding house. The older woman's concerns were practical rather than emotional. Focused on the disruption Rose's absence had caused to household routines and the worry it had generated among the other residents. 2 days without a word, Mrs. Whitman scolded as they walked through Tucson's dusty streets toward the boarding house. "I had no idea whether you'd been attacked by wild animals, gotten lost, or simply decided to abandon your lodging without notice. The other ladies were quite concerned about your welfare." Margaret Rose found herself touched by this evidence that her fellow residents had actually worried about her disappearance. During her previous weeks at the boarding house, she had felt invisible and disconnected from the small community that shared Mrs. Whitman's establishment. The knowledge that her absence had been noticed and regretted suggested possibilities for human connection that she had not previously recognized. "Perhaps," Margaret Rose admitted, "but I will not be responsible for bringing danger to people who have shown me nothing but kindness." The discussion that followed involved the entire adult population of the camp, as Running Bear called a council to address the crisis that Margaret Rose's presence had inadvertently created. She listened to discussions conducted in Apache, understanding nothing of the words, but recognizing the serious consideration being given to various alternatives. Morning Star approached during a pause in the formal deliberations, taking Margaret Rose's hands in her own while speaking earnestly in Apache. Though the language was incomprehensible, the emotion behind the words was unmistakable. Morning Star was pleading with Margaret Rose not to sacrifice herself for the community's safety. "She says that you have become her sister," Running Bear translated. "She says that sisters do not abandon each other when trouble comes. They face difficulties together." The simple declaration broke Margaret Rose's heart because it represented the kind of family bond she had never experienced, even during her marriage to Kenneth. Morning Star was claiming kinship based on affection and choice rather than blood or legal obligation, offering the unconditional loyalty that Margaret Rose had spent her entire life seeking. "Tell her that I cherish her friendship," Margaret Rose replied, "but I cannot allow my problems to become her people's problems." The council reached a decision after nearly 2 hours of discussion. Running Bear would escort Margaret Rose back toward Tucson, but not directly to the town. Instead, they would create evidence that she had become lost in the desert and been found by a Mexican trader who was returning her to safety. This would explain her absence while avoiding any suggestion that she had been in contact with Apache bands. "And after that?" Margaret Rose asked, recognizing that this solution addressed the immediate crisis without resolving her underlying problems. "After that, you must choose," Running Bear said gravely. "You can continue trying to build a life among people who have already decided you have nothing valuable to offer them. Or you can trust that there are other ways to find meaning and purpose in this world." The journey back toward Tucson required most of the day, following routes that would support the cover story Running Bear had devised. They traveled in silence for long stretches, both understanding that they were approaching a parting that might be permanent. Margaret Rose found herself memorizing details of the desert landscape, the play of light on distant mountains, subtle beauty of plants that thrived in conditions that would kill more delicate species. "You spoke of becoming someone new," she said, as they paused to rest during the afternoon heat. "What did you mean exactly?" Running Bear smiled, recognizing the question as evidence that Margaret Rose was still considering alternatives to returning to her previous life. I meant that you could choose to define yourself by your own values rather than others' expectations. You could decide what kind of woman you want to be and then become that person, regardless of whether such a choice fits. Conventional patterns. Would such a choice require living with your people? Not necessarily, Running Bear replied thoughtfully. But it would require courage to reject the judgments that have been made about you and wisdom to recognize your own worth. These qualities could serve you anywhere, among any people. As evening approached, they reached the predetermined location where Margaret Rose would wait to be discovered by the Mexican trader, who was part of Running Bear's elaborate deception. The man, introduced as Carlos Mendoza, was a weathered individual whose extensive trading relationships had made him valuable to Apache bands, seeking to obtain supplies without direct contact with white authorities. "Senora," Carlos said in heavily accented English, "I am told you have been wandering in the desert. This is very dangerous. You are fortunate to be alive." The charade felt strange to Margaret Rose, but she recognized its necessity. Carlos would take her to the outskirts of Tucson and deliver her to authorities with a story that explained her absence without compromising the Apache camp's security. She would be returned to exactly the same circumstances she had fled, but with new knowledge about alternatives that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional society. Running Bear's farewell was brief but meaningful. "Remember what I told you," he said quietly. "You will never be alone again. This is true whether you choose to return to us or find another path forward. You have learned that there are people in this world who value what you have to offer. That knowledge changes everything, even if you never see us again." As Carlos's wagon carried her toward the lights of Tucson, Margaret Rose felt as if she were leaving one world and reluctantly returning to another. The choice Running Bear had offered remained open to her, but acting on it would require courage she was not certain she possessed. The safe path led back to Mrs. Whitman's boarding house, and the gradual descent into desperation she had been facing before her desert encounter. The dangerous path led toward an uncertain future that promised meaning and acceptance at the cost of everything familiar and conventional in her life. Margaret Rose's return to Tucson created a sensation that far exceeded her expectations or desires. Carlos Mendoza delivered her to the sheriff's office just as the sun was setting, his carefully rehearsed story of finding a lost white woman in the desert spreading through this small frontier community like wildfire. Within an hour, curious townspeople had gathered outside the building, eager to hear first-hand accounts of her supposed ordeal and survival in Apache territory. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford was a lean man in his 50s whose weathered face spoke of decades spent mediating between the competing interests of settlers, territorial authorities, and the various tribal groups that still maintained a presence in the region. His gray eyes studied Margaret Rose with the careful attention of someone accustomed to distinguishing truth from deception in the stories brought to his office. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat in the chair across from his desk, "Carlos here tells me he found you wandering about 10 miles southeast of town, suffering from exposure and dehydration. Says you told him you'd been lost for 2 days after taking a walk that went longer than planned." Margaret Rose nodded, maintaining the composed demeanor she had practiced during the wagon ride into town. "I'm embarrassed to admit that I seriously underestimated the challenges of desert travel. I thought I was following a clear path back to town, but I became disoriented when darkness fell." Sheriff Crawford made notes on a piece of paper, his expression suggesting skepticism about certain aspects of her account. "Mighty fortunate that Carlos happened to be in that particular area. The desert's a big place, and there's plenty of folks who've wandered off and never been seen again." "I'm very grateful for his assistance," Margaret Rose replied, recognizing that the sheriff was probing for inconsistencies in their story. "I don't know what would have happened to me if he hadn't come along when he did." The questioning continued for nearly an hour, with Sheriff Crawford asking detailed questions about her route, the landmarks she remembered, and her condition when Carlos found her. Margaret Rose answered as honestly as possible within the constraints of the deception, drawing on her actual desert experience while omitting any reference to the Apache camp or its inhabitants. "Strange thing is," Sheriff Crawford said eventually, "we had reports of Apache sign in that same general area. A patrol went out yesterday looking for evidence of hostile activity, but they didn't find anything conclusive. You didn't happen to see any Indians during your wandering, did you?" Margaret Rose felt her heart racing, but managed to maintain her composure. "I saw no one until Carlos found me. I was focused entirely on finding water and shelter from the sun." Sheriff Crawford studied her face for several more seconds before apparently deciding that her story, while perhaps incomplete, posed no threat to community safety. "Well, Mrs. Sullivan, you're a lucky woman. The desert doesn't often give folks second chances when they make mistakes like that." Mrs. Whitman arrived at the sheriff's office just as Margaret Rose was being released, her expression combining relief with the kind of stern disapproval that suggested lectures would follow once they returned to the boarding house. The older woman's concerns were practical rather than emotional, focused on the disruption Margaret Rose's absence had caused to household routines and the worry it had generated among the other residents. "2 days without a word," Mrs. Whitman scolded as they walked through Tucson's dusty streets toward the boarding house. "I had no idea whether you'd been attacked by wild animals, gotten lost, or simply decided to abandon your lodging without notice. The other ladies were quite concerned about your welfare." Margaret Rose found herself touched by this evidence that her fellow residents had actually worried about her disappearance. During her previous weeks at the boarding house, she had felt invisible and disconnected from the small community that shared Mrs. Whitman's establishment. The knowledge that her absence had been noticed and regretted suggested possibilities for human connection that she had not previously recognized. The boarding house's dining room buzzed with excitement when Margaret Rose appeared for the late evening meal. Her fellow residents, mostly single women who worked as seamstresses, shop clerks, and domestic servants, gathered around her with genuine concern and curiosity about her desert adventure. For the first time since arriving in Tucson, Margaret Rose found herself the center of positive attention rather than suspicious evaluation. "You must have been terrified," said Miss Rebecca Torres, a young Mexican-American woman who worked as a translator for various business establishments. "The desert at night is full of dangers, and everyone knows there are Apache bands still operating in the territory." "I was certainly frightened," Margaret Rose admitted, recognizing that honesty about her emotional state would make her story more credible. "But I tried to focus on practical survival rather than letting fear overwhelm my judgment." Miss Elizabeth Hayes, an older woman who taught at the local schoolhouse, leaned forward with obvious interest. "What did you eat? How did you find water? I've always wondered how someone could survive in such harsh conditions without proper preparation." Margaret Rose drew on her observations of Apache survival techniques to provide detailed answers about desert plants, water sources, and shelter construction. Her knowledge impressed the other women and lent authenticity to her cover story, while also revealing capabilities that had not been apparent during her previous job searches. "You seem to know quite a lot about desert survival for someone who's new to the territory," observed Mrs. Dorothy Fleming, a widow who managed the books for several local businesses. "Did you study such things before coming to Arizona?" "My late husband was interested in natural history and survival skills," Margaret Rose improvised, creating a fictional version of Kenneth that bore no resemblance to the actual man who had abandoned her. "He believed that understanding one's environment was essential for successful frontier living." The conversation continued well past the usual bedtime hour, with Margaret Rose finding herself genuinely enjoying the company of women who were treating her as an equal rather than an object of pity or suspicion. Her desert adventure had inadvertently transformed her status from desperate cast-off to interesting survivor, opening social doors that had remained firmly closed during her previous attempts to establish herself in the community. Over the following days, Margaret Rose discovered that her newfound reputation as a capable and knowledgeable woman had created employment opportunities that had not existed before her disappearance. Miss Hayes approached her about providing tutoring services for students who were struggling with their studies, recognizing that Margaret Rose's education and apparent practical wisdom made her well suited for such work. The territorial government has been pushing for improved educational standards, Miss Hayes explained during their meeting at the schoolhouse. But I'm the only certified teacher for nearly 50 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old. I simply cannot provide the individual attention that some of them need to master their lessons. Margaret Rose accepted the tutoring position eagerly, recognizing that teaching work would provide both income and intellectual satisfaction, while allowing her to use skills that had been ignored by other potential employers. The arrangement called for her to work with students in the late afternoons and early evenings, supplementing Miss Hayes's classroom instruction with personalized attention to their specific learning needs. The tutoring work proved successful beyond anyone's expectations. Margaret Rose's patient teaching methods and genuine interest in her students' progress created rapid improvements in their academic performance, leading to requests for additional services from parents who had initially been skeptical about hiring a woman with no local references. Mrs. Fleming offered Margaret Rose part-time bookkeeping work for several businesses that needed someone with mathematical skills and careful attention to detail. The combination of tutoring and bookkeeping provided enough income to cover her basic expenses while building a reputation for reliability and competence that opened doors to additional opportunities. Yet even as her external circumstances improved dramatically, Margaret Rose found herself haunted by memories of her time in the Apache camp and the choice that Running Bear had offered her. The conventional success she was achieving in Tucson felt hollow compared to the sense of belonging and purpose she had experienced during her brief time with his people. Her dreams were filled with images of Morning Star's gentle kindness, the sound of children learning through play rather than rigid discipline, and the sight of men and women working together as equals in pursuit of common goals. She would wake from these dreams with tears on her cheeks, mourning the loss of a life she had experienced for only one night, but which had felt more real than anything in her previous existence. The internal conflict intensified when Carlos Mendoza appeared at the boarding house 3 weeks after her return, ostensibly conducting business with local merchants, but clearly carrying a message from the Apache camp. He approached her discreetly during her evening walk, speaking in low tones that would not attract unwanted attention. "The tall one asks me to tell you that the offer remains open," Carlos said without preamble. "He says to remind you that courage grows stronger with practice, and that the first step toward a new life is always the most difficult." Margaret Rose felt her heart racing at this unexpected contact. "How are they? Is the camp safe? Did the soldiers cause any problems?" "They are well," Carlos assured her. "The soldiers found nothing because there was nothing to find in the places they searched. But the tall one worries about you. He says your spirit was healing when you left them, but returning to this place might have reopened old wounds that need different medicine." The accuracy of Running Bear's assessment struck Margaret Rose with painful force. Her professional success in Tucson had restored her confidence in her practical abilities, but it had not addressed the deeper emotional wounds caused by Kenneth's betrayal and society's rejection. She was functioning effectively, but she was not truly living. "What would happen if I chose to return to them?" she asked quietly, voicing a question that had tormented her for weeks. Carlos smiled, recognizing the significance of her inquiry. "You would disappear from this world and be reborn in another. It has been done before, by those who found that the life they were born into was not the life their souls required. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of other evening walkers, forcing Carlos to assume the role of casual acquaintance rather than messenger. But his words echoed in Margaret Rose's mind long after he had departed, crystallizing thoughts and feelings that she had been trying to suppress since her return to conventional society. That night, Margaret Rose lay awake weighing the competing claims of safety and authenticity, security and meaning, social acceptance and personal fulfillment. Her life in Tucson offered respectability, financial stability, and the kind of conventional success that society valued. But it also required her to suppress the most essential parts of her identity, to pretend that her brief experience of genuine community and belonging had been merely an interesting adventure rather than a revelation about alternative ways of living. The decision that would determine the rest of her life crystallized suddenly, with the clarity that comes when internal conflicts finally resolve themselves into unmistakable certainty. Margaret Rose understood that she could continue building a respectable existence in Tucson, gradually climbing the social ladder, until she achieved a kind of hollow success that would impress observers while leaving her soul empty and unfulfilled. She could choose courage over comfort, authenticity over acceptability, and trust that the love and acceptance she had experienced in the Apache camp represented a more meaningful foundation for building a life than the grudging tolerance she had earned through conformity to expectations that had never fit her true nature. The choice, when it finally came, felt less like a decision than like an acknowledgement of truth that had been growing in her heart since the moment Running Bear first spoke to her beside that desert boulder. Margaret Rose Sullivan, the abandoned wife who had tried desperately to find acceptance in white frontier society, would cease to exist. In her place would emerge someone new, someone whose identity was defined by choice rather than circumstance, by love rather than fear, by the courage to embrace an unconventional path toward genuine happiness. 3 days later, Margaret Rose informed Mrs. Whitman that she had received word of a family emergency that required her immediate departure from Tucson. She settled her accounts, gathered her few possessions, and prepared to disappear from the conventional world forever, trusting that Running Bear's promise would prove as reliable as everything else about the man who had offered her a chance to become who she was truly meant to be. Margaret Rose's carefully orchestrated disappearance from Tucson required weeks of meticulous planning and the kind of deception she had never imagined herself capable of executing. She began by gradually reducing her commitments, informing her tutoring students and bookkeeping clients that she would be unavailable for extended periods due to family obligations that might eventually require her permanent relocation. The explanations were accepted without suspicion, as her reputation for reliability and honesty had made such sudden changes seem uncharacteristic but not impossible. The most challenging aspect of her preparation involved acquiring supplies and equipment that would be essential for life in the Apache camp without arousing suspicion about her true intentions. She purchased items gradually over several weeks, visiting different merchants and explaining each acquisition with plausible cover stories. Practical clothing suitable for desert living was justified as preparation for extended travel to visit relatives in remote areas. Medical supplies and basic tools were described as gifts for family members establishing homesteads in unsettled territory. Miss Rebecca Torres inadvertently provided crucial assistance when she mentioned her own family's connections to Mexican traders who specialized in providing goods to isolated communities throughout the Southwest. Through Rebecca's introduction, Margaret Rose was able to acquire items that would have been difficult to obtain through conventional retail channels: sturdy leather goods, preserved foods that would remain edible for months, and the kind of practical equipment that frontier families required for self-sufficient living. My cousin Miguel trades with ranchers and mining camps throughout Sonora and southern Arizona, Rebecca explained during one of their conversations in the boarding house parlor. If you need anything specific for your family situation, he might Be able to help locate items that aren't available in regular stores. Margaret Rose accepted this offer gratefully, recognizing that Miguel's trading network could provide access to goods, without creating records that might eventually be traced back to her if authorities investigated her disappearance. Through Miguel, she acquired additional blankets, cooking implements, sewing materials, and even a few books that she hoped would be useful for teaching Apache children who might be interested in learning English literacy skills. The emotional preparation for her transformation proved far more difficult than the practical arrangements. Margaret Rose found herself grieving for the identity she was preparing to abandon, even though that identity had brought her more pain than joy. She was mourning the death of dreams that had sustained her through years of disappointment. The fantasy of reconciliation with Kenneth, the hope of eventual acceptance by respectable society, and the deeply ingrained belief that happiness required conformity to conventional expectations. During her final weeks in Tucson, Margaret Rose spent hours walking through the desert surrounding the town, familiarizing herself with landmarks and trails that would be essential for finding her way to the Apache camp without assistance. She practiced skills that Running Bear and his people had demonstrated during her brief stay, identifying edible plants, locating water sources, reading weather signs, and moving through terrain without leaving obvious tracks. These solitary expeditions also served as opportunities for reflection and preparation for the psychological transformation that awaited her. Margaret Rose understood that joining the Apache community would require more than simply changing her living arrangements. It would demand fundamental alterations in her thinking, her values, and her understanding of what constituted a meaningful life. She began practicing Apache words and phrases that she remembered from her time in the camp, knowing that language acquisition would be essential for full integration into the community. Her memory of Running Bear's precise English pronunciation helped her approximate correct sounds, though she recognized that fluency would require months or years of constant practice and correction. The night before her planned departure, Margaret Rose sat at the small writing desk in her boarding house room and composed letters that would never be sent, but which helped her process the magnitude of the choice she was making. She wrote to Kenneth, expressing forgiveness for his betrayal, while explaining why his abandonment had ultimately freed her to discover her authentic self. She wrote to her deceased parents, thanking them for the education and moral foundation that had given her the strength to survive Kenneth's betrayal and choose an unconventional path toward happiness. Most importantly, she wrote to the woman she had been, acknowledging the courage and resilience that had carried Margaret Rose Sullivan through the darkest period of her life while preparing to release that identity in favor of someone new. The act of writing these farewell letters provided emotional closure and strengthened her resolve to complete the transformation she had begun. Margaret Rose left Tucson before dawn on a Thursday morning in late October, when the desert air carried the first hints of winter cooling, and the stars were still visible in the lightening sky. She had timed her departure to coincide with Carlos Mendoza's regular trading expedition, knowing that his familiarity with Apache territory would be essential for reaching the camp safely. Carlos met her at a predetermined location, several miles outside town, his pack train loaded with goods destined for isolated communities throughout the region. His greeting was warm, but subdued, reflecting his understanding of the significance of Margaret Rose's decision and the irreversible nature of the journey they were beginning together. "You are certain about this choice, Senora?" he asked as they loaded her possessions onto one of his pack animals. "Once we reach the camp, there will be no easy path back to the life you are leaving behind. I am more certain of this than I have been of anything in my entire life," Margaret Rose replied, feeling a sense of peace and rightness that had eluded her since childhood. "Whatever challenges await me, they cannot be worse than living a life that denies everything essential about who I truly am." The journey to the Apache camp took 3 days, following routes that avoided well-traveled paths and settlements where Their passage might be observed and remembered. Carlos proved to be an excellent traveling companion, sharing stories about the various communities he served while providing practical instruction about desert survival techniques that supplemented what Margaret Rose had learned during her previous visit. The Apache people have taught me much about living in harmony with this land, Carlos explained as they rested during the heat of the second day. They understand that survival requires cooperation with natural forces rather than attempts to dominate or control them. This wisdom applies to human relationships as well as environmental challenges. Margaret Rose absorbed these lessons eagerly, recognizing that her success in Apache society would depend on her ability to adopt their perspectives and values rather than trying to impose her own cultural assumptions on their way of life. The desert landscape through which they traveled began to feel less like hostile territory and more like a challenging but beautiful environment that could nurture those who approached it with proper respect and understanding. On the evening of the third day, they reached the box canyon that concealed the Apache camp, arriving just as the community was gathering for the evening meal. Margaret Rose's return was greeted with joy that exceeded her most optimistic expectations, as men, women, and children emerged from their wickiups to welcome her back with genuine enthusiasm and affection. Running Bear's expression as he approached her was one of quiet satisfaction, as if her arrival confirmed predictions he had made, but had not dared voice aloud. "You have chosen to become who you were always meant to be," he said simply, embracing her with the warmth reserved for family members returning from dangerous journeys. Morning Star's welcome was even more emotional, as the Apache woman wept openly while holding Margaret Rose in her arms and speaking rapidly in her native language. Running Bear translated her words with obvious pleasure. "She says that her heart has been incomplete since you left, and that now her sister has returned to make the family whole again." The celebration that followed Margaret Rose's return lasted well into the night, with community members sharing food, stories, and songs that welcomed her into their midst as a permanent member rather than a temporary guest. She was given Apache clothing to replace her white woman's dress, with Morning Star and other women spending hours helping her learn to wear the practical garments that would be essential for participating fully in camp life. The transformation began immediately as Margaret Rose found herself assigned tasks and responsibilities that made her a contributing member of the community rather than a dependent outsider. She worked alongside Apache women, learning to prepare traditional foods, process plant fibers for weaving, and maintain the wickiups that provided shelter for extended family groups. Margaret Rose's carefully orchestrated disappearance from Tucson required weeks of meticulous planning and the kind of deception she had never imagined herself capable of executing. She began by gradually reducing her commitments, informing her tutoring students and bookkeeping clients that she would be unavailable for extended periods due to family obligations that might eventually require her permanent relocation. The explanations were accepted without suspicion, as her reputation for reliability and honesty had made such sudden changes seem uncharacteristic but not impossible. The most challenging aspect of her preparation involved acquiring supplies and equipment that would be essential for life in the Apache camp without arousing suspicion about her true intentions. She purchased items gradually over several weeks, visiting different merchants and explaining each acquisition with plausible cover stories. Practical clothing suitable for desert living was justified as preparation for extended travel to visit relatives in remote areas. Medical supplies and basic tools were described as gifts for family members establishing homesteads in unsettled territory. Miss Rebecca Torres inadvertently provided crucial assistance when she mentioned her own family's connections to Mexican traders who specialized in providing goods to isolated communities throughout the Southwest. Through Rebecca's introduction, Margaret Rose was able to acquire items that would have been difficult to obtain through conventional retail channels: sturdy leather goods, preserved foods that would remain edible for months, and the kind of practical equipment that frontier families required for self-sufficient living. My cousin Miguel trades with ranchers and mining camps throughout Sonora and southern Arizona, Rebecca explained during one of their conversations in the boarding house parlor. If you need anything specific for your family situation, he might be able to help locate items that aren't available in regular stores. Margaret Rose accepted this offer gratefully, recognizing that Miguel's trading network could provide access to goods without creating records that might eventually be traced back to her if authorities investigated her disappearance. Through Miguel, she acquired additional blankets, cooking implements, sewing materials, and even a few books that she hoped would be useful for teaching Apache children who might be interested in learning English literacy skills. The emotional preparation for her transformation proved far more difficult than the practical arrangements. Margaret Rose found herself grieving for the identity she was preparing to abandon, even though that identity had brought her more pain than joy. She was mourning the death of dreams that had sustained her through years of disappointment. The fantasy of reconciliation with Kenneth, the hope of eventual acceptance by respectable society, and the deeply ingrained belief that happiness required conformity to conventional expectations. During her final weeks in Tucson, Margaret Rose spent hours walking through the desert surrounding the town, familiarizing herself with landmarks and trails that would be essential for finding her way to the Apache camp without assistance. She practiced skills that Running Bear and his people had demonstrated during her brief stay, identifying edible plants, locating water sources, reading weather signs, and moving through terrain without leaving obvious tracks. These solitary expeditions also served as opportunities for reflection and preparation for the psychological transformation that awaited her. Margaret Rose understood that joining the Apache community would require more than simply changing her living arrangements. It would demand fundamental alterations in her thinking, her values, and her understanding of what constituted a meaningful life. She began practicing Apache words and phrases that she remembered from her time in the camp, knowing that language acquisition would be essential for full integration into the community. Her memory of Running Bear's precise English pronunciation helped her approximate correct sounds, though she recognized that fluency would require months or years of constant practice and correction. The night before her planned departure, Margaret Rose sat at the small writing desk in her boarding house room and composed letters that would never be sent, but which helped her process the magnitude of the choice she was making. She wrote to Kenneth, expressing forgiveness for his betrayal, while explaining why his abandonment had ultimately freed her to discover her authentic self. She wrote to her deceased parents, thanking them for the education and moral foundation that had given her the strength to survive Kenneth's betrayal and choose an unconventional path toward happiness. Most importantly, she wrote to the woman she had been, acknowledging the courage and resilience that had carried Margaret Rose Sullivan through the darkest period of her life while preparing to release that identity in favor of someone new. The act of writing these farewell letters provided emotional closure and strengthened her resolve to complete the transformation she had begun. Margaret Rose left Tucson before dawn on a Thursday morning in late October, when the desert air carried the first hints of winter cooling and the stars were still visible in the lightening sky. She had timed her departure to coincide with Carlos Mendoza's regular trading expedition, knowing that his familiarity with Apache territory would be essential for reaching the camp safely. Carlos met her at a predetermined location, several miles outside town, his pack train loaded with goods destined for isolated communities throughout the region. His greeting was warm but subdued, reflecting his understanding of the significance of Margaret Rose's decision and the irreversible nature of the journey they were beginning together. "You are certain about this choice, Senora?" he asked as they loaded her possessions onto one of his pack animals. "Once we reach the camp, there will be no easy path back to the life you are leaving behind." "I am more certain of this than I "Than of anything in my entire life," Margaret Rose replied, feeling a sense of peace and rightness that had eluded her since childhood. "Whatever challenges await me, they cannot be worse than living a life that denies everything essential about who I truly am." The journey to the Apache camp took 3 days, following routes that avoided well-traveled paths and settlements where their passage might be observed and remembered. Carlos proved to be an excellent traveling companion, sharing stories about the various communities he served while providing practical instruction about desert survival techniques that supplemented what Margaret Rose had learned during her previous visit. "The Apache people have taught me much about living in harmony with this land," Carlos explained as they rested during the heat of the second day. "They understand that survival requires cooperation with natural forces rather than attempts to dominate or control them. This wisdom applies to human relationships as well as environmental challenges." Margaret Rose absorbed these lessons eagerly, recognizing that her success in Apache society would depend on her ability to adopt their perspectives and values rather than trying to impose her own cultural assumptions on their way of life. The desert landscape through which they traveled began to feel less like hostile territory and more like a challenging but beautiful environment that could nurture those who approached it with proper respect and understanding. On the evening of the 3rd day, they reached the box canyon that concealed the Apache camp, arriving just as the community was gathering for the evening meal. Margaret Rose's return was greeted with joy that exceeded her most optimistic expectations, as men, women, and children emerged from their wickiups to welcome her back with genuine enthusiasm and affection. Running Bear's expression as he approached her was one of quiet satisfaction, as if her arrival confirmed predictions he had made, but had not dared voice aloud. "You have chosen to become who you were always meant to be," he said simply, embracing her with the warmth reserved for family members returning from dangerous journeys. Morning Star's welcome was even more emotional, as the Apache woman wept openly while holding Margaret Rose in her arms and speaking rapidly in her native language. Running Bear translated her words with obvious pleasure. "She says that her heart has been incomplete since you left, and that now her sister has returned to make the family whole again." The celebration that followed Margaret Rose's return lasted well into the night, with community members sharing food, stories, and songs that welcomed her into their midst as a permanent member rather than a temporary guest. She was given Apache clothing to replace her white woman's dress, with Morning Star and other women spending hours helping her learn to wear the practical garments that would be essential for participating fully in camp life. The transformation began immediately as Margaret Rose found herself assigned tasks and responsibilities that made her a contributing member of the community rather than a dependent outsider. She worked alongside Apache women, learning to prepare traditional foods, process plant fibers for weaving, and maintain the wickiups that provided shelter for extended family groups. The work was physically demanding but emotionally satisfying in ways that her previous employment in white society had never achieved. Every task served the welfare of the entire community, creating tangible improvements in the quality of life for people she cared about. Her contributions were valued not for their economic potential, but for their role in sustaining the complex web of relationships that held the community together. Running Bear assigned himself the responsibility of teaching Margaret Rose the language skills, cultural knowledge, and practical abilities she would need to function effectively in Apache society. Their daily lessons covered everything from hunting and tracking techniques to the intricate social protocols that governed interactions between different family groups within the band. Learning our ways requires more than memorizing rules and customs, Running Bear explained during one of their instruction sessions. It requires understanding the principles that guide our decisions and the values that shape our relationships with each other and with the natural world. Margaret Rose discovered that Apache society was far more complex and sophisticated than white stereotypes suggested. The community operated according to elaborate systems of reciprocal obligation, seasonal ceremonies, and decision-making processes that ensured everyone's voice was heard and considered. Women held positions of genuine authority and influence, particularly in matters relating to child rearing, resource allocation, and conflict resolution. The educational philosophy that guided the instruction of Apache children fascinated Margaret Rose, as it emphasized practical skills, moral development, and individual capability rather than rote memorization and unquestioning obedience to authority. Children learned through observation, practice, and gentle correction rather than harsh punishment, developing confidence and competence that prepared them for adult responsibilities. Our children must be able to think for themselves and make good decisions even when no adults are present to guide them, explained Wise Owl during one of their conversations about child-rearing practices. The survival of our people depends on individuals who can adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their commitment to community welfare. Margaret Rose began contributing to the children's education by teaching basic English literacy skills to those who expressed interest in learning. Her lessons were voluntary and informal, conducted during evening hours when other daily tasks had been completed. She was careful to present English as a useful tool for dealing with white authorities and traders, rather than as a superior form of communication that should replace Apache language and culture. The children proved to be eager and capable students, quickly mastering reading and writing skills that would serve them well in future interactions with white society. Their progress impressed their parents and grandparents, who recognized that such knowledge might provide advantages for tribal negotiations and business dealings while the community maintained its independence. As autumn progressed toward winter, Margaret Rose found herself gradually shedding the mannerisms, thought patterns, and emotional responses that had characterized her life as a white woman. The transformation was not forced or artificial, but rather represented the natural flowering of personality traits that had been suppressed by the constraints of conventional society. She discovered that she possessed leadership capabilities that had never been recognized or utilized during her marriage to Kenneth. Apache women valued her opinions and frequently sought her advice about practical problems, recognizing that her different cultural background provided useful perspectives on challenges facing the community. Her physical appearance began changing, as well as the demanding daily activities of Apache life replaced her sedentary boarding house existence. The weight that Kenneth had used to justify his abandonment gradually diminished, replaced by muscle tone and physical stamina that enabled her to participate fully in all aspects of community life. More importantly, Margaret Rose's emotional wounds began healing in an environment that valued her intelligence, appreciated her contributions, and provided the kind of unconditional acceptance she had sought throughout her adult life. The crushing sense of inadequacy that had plagued her since Kenneth's betrayal was replaced by growing confidence in her abilities and worth as a human being. Running Bear observed these changes with obvious satisfaction, recognizing that his offer of adoption into Apache society had provided exactly the kind of healing and growth that Margaret Rose required. Their relationship deepened into genuine friendship and mutual respect, based on shared values and complementary strengths rather than romantic attraction or conventional marriage expectations. "You have become the woman you were always meant to be," he told her during one of their evening conversations beside the central fire. "The pain that brought you to us has transformed into strength that serves our entire community." As winter settled over the desert and the Apache band prepared for the seasonal challenges that would test their survival skills and community bonds, Margaret Rose understood that she had successfully completed the most difficult transformation of her life. She was no longer the abandoned wife who had been rejected by white society, but neither was she simply a white woman playing at being Apache. She had become something new, a person whose identity transcended the arbitrary boundaries of race and culture, whose worth was measured by character and contribution rather than conformity to narrow social expectations. The choice to embrace an unconventional life had required courage that she had not known she possessed, but the rewards had exceeded every dream of happiness she had ever dared to imagine. The woman who had once sat beside a desert boulder contemplating the end of her life had died that day, just as surely as if she had perished from exposure and dehydration. In her place had emerged someone stronger, wiser, and more authentically herself than Margaret Rose Sullivan had ever been. The promise that Running Bear had made during their first encounter had proven absolutely true. She would never be alone again, because she had finally found the community where she truly belonged. The military campaign that would determine the fate of Running Bear's band began in earnest during the scorching heat of midsummer, when the desert offered both sanctuary and peril to those who understood its hidden rhythms. Colonel Harrison Blackwood, no relation to the wealthy Newport family that had once employed Margaret Rose in her previous life, arrived at Fort Huachuca with orders that left no room for negotiation or compromise. Every Apache band remaining off-reservation lands was to be captured or eliminated within 6 months. Blackwood was a career military officer whose previous experience fighting Plains Indians had convinced him that native resistance could only be broken through the systematic application of overwhelming force combined with the destruction of the cultural foundations that sustained tribal identity. His strategy involved not just military pursuit, but the deliberate targeting of sacred sites, food sources, and seasonal gathering places that made traditional Apache life possible. Margaret Rose learned of Blackwood's appointment and methods through Carlos Mendoza's intelligence network, which extended throughout the Southwest and included Mexican traders, American merchants, and even sympathetic military contractors who disapproved of the harsh tactics being employed against native populations. The information Carlos provided painted a picture of coordinated brutality that exceeded anything the Apache had previously faced. "This colonel is different from the others," Carlos warned during one of his covert visits to the canyon camp. "He has studied Apache tactics and culture, learning our strengths in order to devise countermeasures that will make traditional resistance impossible. His soldiers carry supplies for extended desert campaigns. His scouts include Apache warriors who have been forced to hunt their own people, and his orders authorize the use of methods that previous commanders considered too extreme." The intelligence was confirmed by refugee families who had escaped from other bands that had already encountered Blackwood's forces. Their accounts spoke of systematic destruction that went beyond military objectives to target the spiritual and cultural elements that held Apache society together. Sacred ceremonial objects were burned, traditional leaders were executed rather than captured, and survivors were scattered to prevent the reformation of tribal groups. Running Bear's response to these reports demonstrated the qualities that had made him an effective leader during less critical times, but which now faced their ultimate test. Rather than succumbing to despair or lashing out with futile gestures of defiance, he called for council meetings that would develop comprehensive strategies for protecting his people while maintaining their essential identity and values. "We face enemies who understand our ways well enough to use that knowledge against us," Running Bear acknowledged during the first of these strategic sessions. "But understanding an enemy's methods can also reveal weaknesses that may be exploited by those who possess superior knowledge of local conditions and greater commitment to the cause they serve." Margaret Rose found herself playing an increasingly central role in these discussions, as her unique background provided insights that purely Apache perspectives might miss. Her years of life in white society, combined with her education and analytical abilities, enabled her to understand the bureaucratic and political pressures driving Blackwood's campaign while identifying potential vulnerabilities in his approach. Blackwood's success depends on completing his mission within the timeline established by his superiors in Washington, she explained during one of the planning sessions. Military careers are built on visible achievements that can be reported. To politicians and newspaper editors who measure progress through simple statistics, numbers of Indians captured, acres of territory pacified, costs per successful operation. This analysis led to strategic insights that proved crucial for the band's survival. If they could avoid decisive confrontations while making Blackwood's mission appear costly and unsuccessful, political pressure might force his replacement, with commanders who would be more willing to negotiate arrangements that preserved some degree of Apache autonomy. The tactics that emerged from these discussions represented a sophisticated blend of traditional Apache warfare methods with innovations inspired by Margaret Rose's understanding of military bureaucracy and American political culture. Rather than engaging in direct combat that would play to the Army's advantages, the band would focus on mobility, deception, and psychological warfare designed to frustrate Blackwood's objectives while minimizing casualties on both sides. Margaret Rose's contributions to these strategies went beyond analysis and planning to include direct participation in operations that required her unique capabilities. Her ability to pass as a white woman when properly dressed and groomed made her invaluable for reconnaissance missions that involved visiting towns and military installations, where Apache scouts would be immediately recognized and captured. During one such mission, Margaret Rose spent 3 days in Tucson posing as the widow of a traveling merchant, gathering intelligence about troop movements and supply arrangements while renewing contact with sympathetic residents who might provide assistance to Apache families seeking refuge from military pursuit. The experience of returning to her former life, even briefly, reinforced her certainty that her transformation had been complete and irreversible. Mrs. Dorothy Fleming, the boarding house bookkeeper who had become friendly with Margaret Rose during her previous residence, failed to recognize her former acquaintance despite several conversations about local business conditions and territorial politics. Margaret Rose Sullivan, who had once desperately sought acceptance in Tucson's white community, had been so thoroughly replaced by the confident Apache woman she had become that even people who had known her well could not make the connection. "You've changed remarkably since your desert adventure," Mrs. Fleming observed during one of their encounters, clearly referring to the transformation she attributed to Margaret Rose's supposed survival experience rather than recognizing the fundamental alteration of identity that had actually occurred. "There's a strength and confidence about you that wasn't there before. The desert has a way of teaching people what they're truly capable of accomplishing." The irony of Mrs. Fleming's comment was not lost on Margaret Rose, who understood that her supposed desert survival had indeed taught her what she was capable of accomplishing, though not in the way that white society imagined. Her real education had come from learning to see herself through Apache eyes rather than accepting the judgments imposed by people who measured human worth according to standards that had nothing to do with character, intelligence, or contribution to community welfare. The intelligence gathered during this reconnaissance mission proved invaluable for planning the band's response to Blackwood's systematic campaign. Margaret Rose learned that the colonel had established a network of informants throughout the territory, offering substantial rewards for information about Apache movements and hideouts. More disturbing still, she discovered that some of these informants were Apache individuals who had been coerced into betraying their own people through threats against family members held on reservation lands. This information led to one of the most difficult decisions Running Bear would face as a leader: whether to eliminate Apache collaborators who posed existential threats to the band's survival, or to seek ways of neutralizing their effectiveness while preserving the moral principles that distinguished Apache resistance from the brutal methods employed by their enemies. Killing other Apache, even those who serve our enemies, wounds our spirits in ways that make victory meaningless, Running Bear explained during the heated discussions that followed Margaret Rose's intelligence report. But allowing traitors to guide soldiers to our families means accepting the destruction of everything we have fought to preserve. The solution that emerged from these debates reflected the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that characterized Apache approaches to conflict resolution. Rather than simply eliminating collaborators, the band would focus on undermining their credibility and effectiveness through carefully orchestrated deception campaigns that provided false information while protecting the community's real activities and locations. Margaret Rose played a crucial role in designing these deception operations, drawing on her knowledge of white society's assumptions and prejudices to create disinformation that military commanders would find credible, while leading their forces away from actual Apache positions. Her understanding of how racial stereotypes shaped white perceptions of Native intelligence enabled her to craft scenarios that appeared authentic while serving the band's strategic objectives. The campaign that followed tested every aspect of Margaret Rose's transformation and integration into Apache society. She participated in night raids designed to capture supplies and weapons, served as translator during negotiations with Mexican officials who might provide sanctuary, and helped coordinate the complex logistics required to keep families fed and protected while maintaining constant mobility to avoid military pursuit. The physical demands of this lifestyle exceeded anything Margaret Rose had experienced during her previous existence, requiring stamina, courage, and practical skills that she had developed during her years of Apache training. The self-dependent woman who had been abandoned at a train station had been replaced by someone capable of traveling 40 miles in a single day, navigating by stars across unmarked desert terrain, and remaining silent and motionless for hours while enemy patrols passed within yards of her hiding place. More importantly, the psychological and emotional strength she had gained through her transformation enabled her to face dangers and hardships that would have broken the Margaret Rose Sullivan of earlier years. The security she had found in Apache society was not the passive safety of protected dependence, but the active confidence of someone who possessed valuable skills and played essential roles in her community's survival. The climax of Blackwood's campaign came during the autumn months, when military pressure had forced most remaining Apache bands to either surrender or flee across the Mexican border. Running Bear's group was among the last holdouts. Their survival dependent on the network of hidden camps and supply caches that had been established through years of careful preparation and the assistance of sympathetic traders and Mexican allies. The final confrontation, when it came, occurred not through direct military action, but through a carefully orchestrated negotiation that drew on every lesson Margaret Rose had learned about white bureaucracy, Apache diplomacy, and the complex political pressures that shaped territorial policy. Carlos Mendoza had arranged a meeting between Running Bear and territorial officials who were beginning to question the costs and effectiveness of Blackwood's harsh methods. Margaret Rose served as translator and advisor during these negotiations, her unique perspective enabling her to identify areas of potential compromise while ensuring that any agreements preserved the essential elements of Apache autonomy and cultural identity. The discussions were conducted in Spanish to avoid the linguistic barriers that had complicated previous negotiations, with Margaret Rose providing crucial cultural interpretation that went beyond mere translation of words. The settlement that emerged from these talks was unprecedented in the history of Apache-American relations. Rather than forced relocation to distant reservations, Running Bear's band would be permitted to establish a permanent settlement on traditional lands within territorial boundaries, with guarantees of limited self-governance and protection from future military interference in exchange for agreements to refrain from raiding activities and to serve as intermediaries for negotiations with other Apache groups. The arrangement required Margaret Rose to serve as official liaison between the Apache community and territorial authorities, a role that drew on every aspect of her education, experience, and cultural knowledge. Her transformation from abandoned Wife to diplomatic representative demonstrated the extraordinary possibilities that could emerge when individuals were freed from conventional limitations and allowed to develop their authentic capabilities. Colonel Blackwood's reaction to this negotiated settlement was predictably hostile, as it represented a repudiation of the harsh methods he had been authorized to employ. His attempts to sabotage the agreement through continued military harassment were countered by political pressure from territorial officials who recognized that peaceful resolution of Apache resistance would be far more beneficial for regional development than ongoing military campaigns. The colonel's eventual reassignment to a remote posting in Alaska marked the end of the systematic campaign against Apache independence, though it did not eliminate all threats to the community's survival. Margaret Rose understood that their success in preserving freedom and cultural identity was precarious, dependent on continued vigilance and careful navigation of changing political conditions. As winter approached and the community began establishing their permanent settlement, Margaret Rose reflected on the extraordinary journey that had transformed her from a desperate cast-off into a leader whose decisions affected the welfare of dozens of families. The promise Running Bear had made during their first encounter had proven more prophetic than either of them had imagined. She had indeed never been alone again. But more than that, she had become someone whose strength and wisdom served others, who might otherwise have faced their struggles in isolation. The love that had grown between Margaret Rose and Running Bear had been tested and strengthened by shared commitment to purposes greater than personal happiness, creating a partnership that transcended cultural boundaries while honoring the values of both their backgrounds. Their marriage had become a symbol of the possibilities that could emerge when individuals chose courage over comfort, authenticity over conformity, and love over fear. Standing beside Running Bear, as they watched their people construct the permanent wiki-ups that would shelter them through the coming winter, Margaret Rose understood that her transformation was complete but not finished. The woman who had once sat beside a desert boulder contemplating the end of her life had discovered that endings could become beginnings, that apparent failures could reveal hidden strengths, and that the courage to embrace an unconventional path could lead to forms of success that conventional society could never have imagined or provided. 5 years had passed since the establishment of the permanent Apache settlement, and Margaret Rose stood at the edge of the mesa overlooking the valley that had become home to nearly 200 Apache families who had chosen freedom over reservation confinement. The community that had grown around Running Bear's original band now included refugees from across the Southwest, drawn by reports of a place where traditional ways could be preserved while adapting to the changing realities of territorial life. Settlement bore little resemblance to the temporary camps that had characterized Apache life during the years of military pursuit. Substantial dwellings constructed according to traditional architectural principles dotted the landscape, connected by well-maintained paths that led to communal areas where children played, elders taught, and families gathered for ceremonies that celebrated the continuity of Apache culture, despite the pressures of surrounding white civilization. Margaret Rose's role in creating this sanctuary had evolved far beyond her original function as liaison between the community and territorial authorities. She had become something unprecedented in the history of Apache-American relations, a bridge between worlds whose unique perspective enabled both cultures to understand each other more clearly while maintaining their essential identities and values. Her influence extended throughout the territory as territorial governors, military commanders, and federal officials sought her advice on policies affecting native populations. The success of Running Bear's settlement had attracted national attention as a potential model for resolving conflicts between expanding American civilization and indigenous communities that refused to disappear into the reservations that were designed to eliminate tribal identity. Newspaper articles from as far away as New York and San Francisco described Margaret Rose as the white woman who became Apache, though such descriptions miss the complexity of her transformation and the sophisticated diplomacy required to maintain the delicate balance that preserved her community's independence. She had not simply adopted Apache identity. She had created something new that honored both her birth culture and her chosen family while serving purposes that transcended narrow ethnic loyalties. The children playing in the settlement's central plaza represented the future that Margaret Rose and Running Bear had worked to secure through years of dangerous struggle and careful negotiation. Apache boys and girls learned traditional skills and values while also acquiring the English literacy and cultural knowledge that would enable them to navigate successfully in a world increasingly dominated by white civilization. Margaret Rose had established a school that operated according to educational principles derived from both Apache and European pedagogical traditions. Students learned to read and write in English, Spanish, and Apache languages while studying mathematics, natural science, and geography alongside traditional crafts, hunting skills, and ceremonial knowledge. The curriculum prepared them to function effectively in either world while maintaining pride in their Apache heritage. The success of this educational experiment had attracted attention from reformers throughout the United States who sought alternatives to the harsh assimilation policies implemented at government boarding schools. Delegations of educators, missionaries, and government officials regularly visited the settlement to observe teaching methods that seemed to achieve cultural integration without destroying indigenous identity. During one such visit, Margaret Rose found herself in conversation with Dr. Sarah Henderson, a pioneering female educator from the East Coast who had traveled to Arizona specifically to study the settlement's approaches to intercultural education. Dr. Henderson's questions revealed assumptions about Native intelligence and capability that Margaret Rose had once shared, but which her years of Apache life had completely transformed. "How do you manage to teach these children advanced academic subjects?" Dr. Henderson asked with barely concealed surprise. "I had understood that Indian children lack the intellectual capacity for abstract reasoning and complex problem-solving that European education requires." Margaret Rose's response drew on years of experience observing Apache children's remarkable abilities to master sophisticated skills and concepts when instruction was provided in culturally appropriate formats. "Apache children are among the most intelligent and capable students I have ever encountered," she replied firmly. "Their supposed academic deficiencies result from educational methods that ignore their learning styles and cultural backgrounds, rather than from any inherent intellectual limitations." The conversation that followed challenged Dr. Henderson's preconceptions while illustrating the broader prejudices that had shaped American Indian policy for decades. Margaret Rose explained how Apache children learned complex hunting strategies, intricate social protocols, and sophisticated ecological knowledge through observation, practice, and oral instruction that achieved results far superior to the rote memorization and harsh discipline employed in government schools. These children routinely solve problems that would challenge college students, Margaret Rose continued, but their intelligence is expressed through practical applications rather than abstract academic exercises that have no connection to their lived experience. When academic subjects are presented in ways that connect to their existing knowledge and interests, they excel beyond anyone's expectations. Dr. Henderson's visit concluded with a written report that praised the settlement's educational achievements, while recommending similar approaches at other institutions serving Native populations. Though such recommendations were rarely implemented due to bureaucratic resistance and cultural prejudice, they represented growing recognition that Margaret Rose's methods produced results that traditional assimilation policies could not achieve. The economic success of the settlement provided additional evidence that Apache communities could prosper without abandoning their cultural identity or accepting complete dependence on government support. Under Running Bear's leadership and Margaret Rose's guidance, The community had developed diversified economic activities that generated substantial income while maintaining ecological sustainability and traditional values. Apache craftspeople produced baskets, pottery, textiles, and metalwork that commanded premium prices in markets throughout the Southwest and beyond. The exceptional quality of these products reflected generations of accumulated skill combined with artistic innovations that appealed to non-native consumers while maintaining cultural authenticity and spiritual significance. The settlement also served as headquarters for a trading network that extended throughout northern Mexico and the American Southwest, with Carlos Mendoza and other Mexican partners facilitating commerce that brought prosperity to isolated communities on both sides of the border. Margaret Rose's linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge made her invaluable for negotiating these complex commercial relationships. Agricultural production based on traditional Apache farming methods supplemented hunting and gathering activities that were adapted to the reduced territory available for such pursuits. The community's food security was further enhanced by careful management of water resources and systematic cultivation of medicinal and ceremonial plants that were essential for maintaining cultural practices. Yet the most significant aspect of the settlement's success was its demonstration that Apache society could evolve and adapt without losing its essential character. Traditional governance structures continued to function effectively, with decisions made through consensus-building processes that ensured every voice was heard and considered. Gender roles remained more egalitarian than those found in white society, with women exercising genuine authority in matters affecting community welfare. Religious and ceremonial life flourished in ways that had become impossible for Apache communities confined to reservations where such practices were often forbidden or severely restricted. Sacred sites within the settlement's territory were protected and maintained according to traditional protocols, while seasonal ceremonies continued to mark important transitions in the agricultural and spiritual calendar. Margaret Rose's personal relationship with Running Bear had deepened into a partnership that transcended romantic love to become genuine collaboration in service of their community's welfare. Their marriage had produced 3 children whose mixed heritage embodied the cultural synthesis that their parents had worked to achieve on a larger scale. The eldest child, a daughter named Rosa Elena in honor of both her mother's birth name and Apache naming traditions, displayed remarkable abilities that suggested she might eventually assume leadership responsibilities within the community. At 12 years old, she already demonstrated fluency in 3 languages, sophisticated understanding of both Apache and white cultural norms, and the kind of diplomatic skills that had made her mother so effective in intercultural negotiations. 2 younger children, sons named David Running Bear and Miguel Swift Arrow, showed different but equally promising combinations of their parents' capabilities. David excelled in traditional Apache skills while also demonstrating academic abilities that might eventually lead to formal education in white institutions. Miguel displayed artistic talents that found expression through both Apache crafts and European-influenced painting and drawing. Margaret Rose's relationship with her children reflected her determination to ensure they understood and valued both sides of their heritage. They learned Apache values and traditions from their father and extended family, while also gaining knowledge of white society that would enable them to function effectively in that world if they chose to do so. Most importantly, they were taught to see their mixed background as a source of strength rather than a burden or limitation. The challenges facing the settlement were not primarily external, though periodic political changes in territorial and federal administrations created ongoing uncertainties about the legal protections that guaranteed the community's autonomy. More significant were the internal tensions that inevitably arose when traditional societies adapted to changing circumstances while trying to preserve essential cultural elements. Younger community members sometimes chafed at restrictions that seemed arbitrary or outdated, particularly those relating to interactions with white society and participation in opportunities that required extended absence from the settlement. Older Apache who had experienced the worst aspects of military persecution remained suspicious of any accommodation with white civilization, preferring complete separation, even if such isolation limited economic and educational opportunities. Margaret Rose found herself frequently mediating between these competing perspectives, drawing on her unique position to help community members understand the benefits and risks associated with different approaches to cultural adaptation. Her own experience of transformation provided credibility when she counseled patients with change, while insisting on the preservation of core values and practices. Change is not betrayal, she would remind community members during discussions of controversial issues. We can learn new skills, adopt useful innovations, and engage with the outside world without abandoning the principles that make us Apache. The strength of our culture lies not in rigid adherence to specific practices, but in our commitment to the values and relationships that bind us together as a people. These conversations were conducted in Apache language, which Margaret Rose had mastered to the point where she could express complex ideas with the kind of eloquence and cultural nuance that commanded respect from even the most traditional community members. Her linguistic achievement represented years of dedicated study and practice, but more importantly, it demonstrated her complete commitment to Apache identity. Despite her birth into white society, the settlement's success had not gone unnoticed by hostile elements within territorial society who viewed any form of Apache independence as a threat to white supremacy and economic dominance. Periodic attempts were made to revoke the legal agreements that protected the community, usually through claims that Apache prosperity represented unfair competition with white businesses or that the settlement served as a base for criminal activities. Margaret Rose's diplomatic skills were frequently tested by these challenges, as she worked with sympathetic lawyers, politicians, and business leaders to defend the community's legal rights, while addressing legitimate concerns about intercultural relations. Her reputation for honesty and fair dealing had earned respect from many white officials who might otherwise have been hostile to Apache interests. The most serious threat to the settlement came not from external enemies, but from Margaret Rose's past, when a chance encounter in territorial capital brought her face to face with someone who recognized her, despite the years of transformation that had made such recognition seem impossible. Kenneth Sullivan had come to Phoenix on business related to his California manufacturing interests, his appearance and manner reflecting the prosperity and social status he had achieved through the marriage and career advancement that had motivated his abandonment of Margaret Rose. His shock at encountering his former wife was compounded by his inability to reconcile the confident, respected woman she had become with the desperate, dependent person he remembered. The confrontation took place in the lobby of the Territorial Capitol building, where Margaret Rose had been meeting with officials about educational funding for the settlement school. Kenneth's recognition was immediate and unmistakable, though his approach was hesitant and uncertain, as if he questioned the evidence of his own eyes. "Margaret Rose?" he said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been regret. "Is it really you?" Margaret Rose's response was calm and measured, reflecting the emotional healing that had occurred during her years of Apache life. "Hello, Kenneth. You look well. California has obviously been good to you." The conversation that followed was brief but revealing, as Kenneth struggled to understand how the woman he had abandoned as worthless had achieved the kind of respect and influence that his own efforts had never secured. Margaret Rose's position as advisor to territorial officials and advocate for Apache rights represented genuine accomplishment that transcended the social climbing and material accumulation that had motivated Kenneth's choices. "I heard rumors about a white woman who had joined the Apache," Kenneth said, his tone suggesting he had dismissed such stories as frontier exaggerations. "I never imagined I mean, you were always so concerned with respectability and social acceptance. I discovered that there are different kinds of respectability, Margaret Rose replied gently. The respect I have earned here is based on what I have contributed to my community's welfare rather than my ability to conform to arbitrary social expectations. It's more satisfying than any approval I ever sought in conventional society. Kenneth's attempts to engage her in personal conversation were politely but firmly deflected, as Margaret Rose made clear that their brief marriage belonged to a past that held no claim on her present life or future plans. Her emotional indifference to his presence demonstrated the completeness of her recovery from the wounds his betrayal had inflicted. "Are you happy?" Kenneth asked finally, perhaps recognizing that conventional measures of success and social status were inadequate for evaluating the life Margaret Rose had created. "I am complete," Margaret Rose answered, choosing her words carefully to convey the profound satisfaction she had found in living according to her authentic values and capabilities. "I am part of something larger than myself, something that gives meaning to every day and purpose to every decision I make." Kenneth's departure from that encounter left Margaret Rose with a profound sense of closure and gratitude for the circumstances that had led to her transformation. The man whose betrayal had seemed like the end of the world had inadvertently provided the catalyst for discoveries about herself and possibilities for fulfillment that she could never have imagined, while living within the constraints of conventional marriage and social expectations. As the settlement prepared for its sixth winter, Margaret Rose reflected on the extraordinary journey that had carried her from despair to purpose, from abandonment to belonging, from powerlessness to influence. The promise Running Bear had made during their first encounter had been fulfilled. Beyond either of their original understanding, she had never been alone again. But more than that, she had become someone whose strength and wisdom ensured that others would never face their struggles in isolation. The legacy she was building extended far beyond her own transformation to encompass the hundreds of Apache families who had found sanctuary and opportunity within the community she had helped to create. The children learning in her school, the craftspeople prospering through traditional skills, the families maintaining their cultural identity while adapting to changing times, all represented living proof that love, courage, and authentic commitment could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Standing beside Running Bear as they watched the sun set over the valley that had become their home, Margaret Rose understood that her story was far from finished. The work of building bridges between cultures, protecting indigenous rights, and demonstrating alternative approaches to intercultural relations would continue for as long as she lived. But the foundation had been established, the model had been proven successful, and the future held possibilities that justified every sacrifice and validated every choice she had made in pursuit of authentic love and meaningful purpose. The woman who had once been abandoned at a desert train station had become a force for healing and understanding whose influence would extend far beyond her own lifetime, touching lives and shaping communities in ways that Kenneth Sullivan's narrow ambitions could never have achieved. Running Bear's promise had indeed proven true. She would never be alone again, because she had learned to see herself as part of something eternal and significant that transcended individual circumstances while celebrating the unique contributions each person could make to the common good. The years that followed brought challenges that tested the settlement's resilience in ways Margaret Rose had not anticipated. A severe drought during the 7th year of the community's existence threatened not only agricultural production, but the very water sources that had made permanent habitation possible. Traditional Apache knowledge of desert survival proved invaluable, but adaptation required innovations that combined ancestral wisdom with new techniques learned through trade relationships and scientific observation. Margaret Rose found herself coordinating relief efforts that extended far beyond the immediate community, as neighboring Mexican villages and even some white settlements faced similar crises. her reputation as a problem solver and mediator made her the natural choice for organizing regional cooperation that transcended ethnic and national boundaries. The success of these collaborative efforts demonstrated that intercultural understanding could produce practical benefits that served everyone's interests. The drought crisis also revealed the strength of the settlement's economic foundations. The diversified income sources that Margaret Rose and Running Bear had developed over years of careful planning provided sufficient resources to purchase emergency supplies and maintain the community through the worst months of water scarcity. Craft production continued even when agricultural activities became impossible, generating revenue that sustained families who might otherwise have been forced to abandon their homes. During this period, Margaret Rose established correspondence with sympathetic researchers and reformers throughout the United States who were documenting the failures of traditional Indian policy while seeking alternative approaches that might achieve better results. Her detailed reports about the settlement's methods and achievements provided evidence that challenged prevailing assumptions about native capabilities and the inevitability of cultural assimilation. Dr. Francis Walker, the federal commissioner of Indian Affairs who had been appointed to reform the reservation system, specifically requested Margaret Rose's input on proposed policy changes that would affect Apache communities throughout the Southwest. Her recommendations emphasized the importance of preserving tribal autonomy while providing educational and economic opportunities that would enable Native communities to prosper without abandoning their cultural identity. The fundamental error in current Indian policy, Margaret Rose wrote in one of her reports to Commissioner Walker, lies in the assumption that assimilation requires the complete destruction of tribal culture and identity. Our experience demonstrates that Native communities can adapt successfully to changing circumstances while maintaining the values and relationships that give their lives meaning and purpose. These policy recommendations were incorporated into experimental programs that were implemented at several other locations, though none achieved the comprehensive success that characterized Margaret Rose's settlement. The political obstacles and bureaucratic resistance that limited these efforts reinforced her understanding that lasting change required long-term commitment and the kind of personal relationships that could overcome institutional inertia. Margaret Rose's influence extended into the growing women's suffrage movement, as Eastern reformers recognized that her achievement of genuine equality within Apache society offered insights that could benefit the struggle for women's rights in white America. Susan B. Anthony herself corresponded with Margaret Rose about strategies for achieving political representation that recognized women's capabilities and contributions. Your example demonstrates that women can exercise leadership and influence when they are freed from artificial constraints and given opportunities to develop their authentic abilities. Anthony wrote in one of her letters, "The respect you have earned within your community provides a model for what women might achieve throughout American society if legal and social barriers were removed." Margaret Rose's responses to these inquiries emphasized that gender equality within Apache society resulted from cultural values that prioritized community welfare over individual dominance, rather than from formal political structures that could be easily replicated in other contexts. Her analysis suggested that lasting change required fundamental shifts in attitudes and assumptions, rather than merely legal reforms that might be reversed by hostile administrations. The settlement's reputation as a successful experiment in intercultural cooperation attracted international attention, with visitors arriving from Europe, Canada, and Latin America to study methods that might be applicable to similar situations in their own countries. Margaret Rose served as guide and interpreter for these delegations, explaining the historical and cultural factors that had made the community's achievements possible. One particularly significant visit came from a delegation of Canadian officials who were seeking alternatives to the harsh policies that had characterized their government's approach to First Nations communities. The visitors spent several weeks observing the settlement's educational, economic, and governance systems while interviewing community members about their experiences and perspectives. "What strikes us most forcefully," observed Dr. James McLeod, the delegation's leader, "is the absence of the despair and social dysfunction that plague reservation communities in our country. Your people appear to have retained their cultural pride and community cohesion while adapting successfully to contemporary economic and political realities." Margaret Rose's explanation of these differences emphasized the importance of preserving indigenous decision-making processes while providing access to resources and opportunities that enabled communities to develop according to their own priorities and values. The Canadian officials departed with detailed recommendations that were eventually incorporated into policy reforms that improved conditions for First Nations communities throughout their country. The settlement's success in maintaining cultural continuity while adapting to changing circumstances was perhaps most evident in the ceremonial and spiritual life that flourished under conditions of security and stability. Sacred dances that had been suppressed on reservations were performed openly, with community members participating in seasonal celebrations that connected them to ancestral traditions while acknowledging contemporary realities. Margaret Rose's participation in these ceremonies represented the final stage of her cultural transformation, as she was formally adopted into clan relationships that made her fully Apache according to traditional definitions of tribal membership. The rituals that marked this adoption were conducted by the most respected elders and medicine people, who recognized that her contributions to the community's welfare qualified her for the highest forms of acceptance and honor. The ceremony took place during the harvest celebration that marked the end of the community's most prosperous year, when abundant crops and successful trading relationships had generated wealth that enabled major improvements in housing, education, and ceremonial facilities. Margaret Rose's adoption was celebrated as evidence that Apache society remained strong enough to welcome worthy individuals, regardless of their origins, while her achievements demonstrated the wisdom of such inclusive approaches to community membership. Running Bear's speech during the adoption ceremony articulated the broader significance of Margaret Rose's transformation for understanding human potential and the possibilities for intercultural cooperation. "She came to us as someone whose people had rejected her," he said, addressing the assembled community. "We welcomed her not out of pity, but because we recognized qualities that her own society had failed to value. Her success among us proves that human worth cannot be measured by the accidents of birth or the prejudices of particular cultures." The personal satisfaction Margaret Rose derived from this recognition was enhanced by her understanding that her story had become a symbol of hope for other women who faced seemingly impossible circumstances. Letters arrived regularly from women throughout the United States and beyond, describing situations of abandonment, abuse, or social rejection while seeking advice about alternatives to conventional solutions that often perpetuated rather than resolved their problems. Margaret Rose's responses to these inquiries drew on her own experience while acknowledging that each woman's situation required careful analysis and individually appropriate solutions. She emphasized the importance of developing authentic self-knowledge and practical capabilities that could provide foundations for independence, while warning against the dangers of simply exchanging one form of dependence for another. "Freedom cannot be given to you by others," she wrote to one correspondent who was contemplating leaving an abusive marriage. "It must be claimed through your own actions and sustained through your own efforts. The courage to choose an unconventional path is only the beginning. Success requires the wisdom to understand what you truly value and the determination to build a life that honors those values regardless of external opposition." These counseling relationships evolved into an informal network of women who supported each other through periods of transition and change, sharing resources and strategies while maintaining connections that transcended geographical and cultural boundaries. Margaret Rose served as a central node in this network, providing guidance and encouragement while learning from the experiences of women who faced different but related challenges, the educational innovations that Margaret Rose had pioneered at the settlement attracted attention from progressive educators who sought alternatives to the rigid, punitive methods that characterized most American schools. Her demonstration that Native children could excel academically when instruction was provided in culturally appropriate formats challenged prevailing assumptions about racial intellectual capacity while suggesting pedagogical approaches that might benefit all students. Dr. Maria Montessori, the Italian physician and educator who was developing revolutionary approaches to childhood education, initiated correspondence with Margaret Rose about methods that emphasized individual development within supportive community contexts. Their exchange of ideas contributed to educational reforms that eventually influenced schooling practices throughout Europe and the Americas. Your work demonstrates that children learn most effectively when their natural curiosity and creativity are nurtured rather than suppressed, Montessori wrote in one of her letters. The respect you show for your students' cultural backgrounds and individual capabilities provides a model that could transform education everywhere if administrators and teachers possessed the wisdom to implement such approaches. Margaret Rose's educational philosophy continued evolving as she gained experience with students from increasingly diverse backgrounds. The settlement's reputation for academic excellence attracted families from various tribal groups, Mexican communities, and even some white families who sought alternatives to conventional schooling for their children. This diversity created opportunities for intercultural learning that enriched the educational experience for all students. The economic prosperity that had enabled the settlement's expansion and improvement also created new challenges related to maintaining cultural authenticity while engaging with market forces that operated according to very different values and priorities. Margaret Rose found herself mediating between community members who wanted to maximize income from craft sales and those who worried that commercial production might compromise the spiritual and artistic integrity of traditional work. The solution that emerged from these discussions reflected the sophisticated understanding of cultural adaptation that had characterized the community's approach to other challenges. Artisans would continue producing ceremonial and personal items according to traditional standards and purposes, while also creating commercial products that incorporated traditional techniques and designs in formats that appealed to outside buyers without violating sacred protocols. This approach proved remarkably successful, generating substantial income while preserving the knowledge and skills that were essential for maintaining Apache cultural identity. The settlement's reputation for producing authentic, high-quality crafts created demand that exceeded the artisans' capacity to supply, enabling them to command premium prices while maintaining control over their working conditions and artistic standards. Margaret Rose's role in developing these economic strategies drew on skills and knowledge that she had acquired through every phase of her transformation, from her early education in white society through her immersion in Apache culture, to her experience mediating between different worldviews and value systems. Her unique perspective enabled her to identify market opportunities that served the community's interests while avoiding compromises that might undermine their cultural integrity. As the settlement approached its 10th anniversary, Margaret Rose reflected on the extraordinary changes that had transformed not only her own life, but the lives of hundreds of families who had found refuge, opportunity, and authentic community within the society she had helped to create. The children who had been born in the settlement were now approaching adulthood, carrying forward cultural knowledge and practical skills that positioned them to succeed in whatever paths they chose to pursue. Her own children had become symbols of the cultural synthesis that represented the settlement's greatest achievement. Rosa Elena had developed into a confident young woman whose leadership abilities and diplomatic skills suggested she might eventually assume Margaret Rose's role as liaison between the Apache community and the outside world. Her fluency in multiple languages and deep understanding of various cultural traditions made her invaluable for negotiations and educational initiatives that required intercultural expertise. David Running Bear had chosen to focus primarily on traditional Apache skills and knowledge, becoming an accomplished hunter and tracker, while also mastering the ceremonial protocols that would enable him to serve as a spiritual leader within the community. His commitment to preserving ancestral traditions provided continuity that balanced the adaptation and innovation that characterized other aspects of settlement life. Miguel Swift Errol had discovered artistic talents that found expression through both traditional Apache crafts and contemporary artistic forms that incorporated elements from various cultural traditions. His work was gaining recognition among collectors and galleries throughout the Southwest, providing additional income for the community, while demonstrating the creative possibilities that emerged from intercultural dialogue and synthesis. The success of Margaret Rose's children in developing their individual capabilities while maintaining strong connections to their community provided evidence that cultural mixing could produce positive results when it occurred within supportive environments that valued diversity and encouraged authentic self-expression. Their achievements challenged racial prejudices and cultural stereotypes, while suggesting approaches to intercultural relations that could benefit broader society. The settlement's influence on regional politics had grown steadily as territorial leaders recognized that the community's success provided a model for peaceful intercultural relations that could reduce conflicts and promote economic development throughout the Southwest. Margaret Rose's reputation as a skilled negotiator and policy analyst made her a trusted advisor whose recommendations carried weight in discussions about land use, water rights, and economic development strategies. Her involvement in these broader political issues reflected her understanding that the settlement's long-term security depended on maintaining positive relationships with neighboring communities and territorial authorities while demonstrating that Apache autonomy served regional interests rather than threatening them. The diplomatic skills she had developed through years of mediating internal community disputes proved equally valuable for managing external relationships and policy negotiations. The personal satisfaction Margaret Rose derived from these achievements was enhanced by her recognition that her transformation had created possibilities for positive change that extended far beyond her individual circumstances. The network of relationships and initiatives that had grown around the settlement represented a living legacy that would continue influencing intercultural relations and social policy long after her own active involvement had ended. Standing beside Running Bear as they watched the sunset paint the desert landscape in brilliant colors that seemed to celebrate the beauty and resilience of the land they had learned to call home, Margaret Rose understood that her journey from abandonment to belonging had become a story of hope and possibility that validated the courage required to choose authentic love over convenient conformity, meaningful purpose over shallow success, and genuine community over isolated individualism. The 20th anniversary of Margaret Rose's arrival in Apache territory brought delegations from across the continent to witness what had become known as the Arizona Miracle, a demonstration that indigenous communities could thrive while maintaining their cultural identity in an increasingly industrialized world. The celebration lasted for 3 days, featuring traditional ceremonies alongside presentations about the settlement's achievements in education, economics, and intercultural cooperation. Among the distinguished visitors was President Theodore Roosevelt himself, whose progressive policies toward conservation and social reform had made him sympathetic to alternative approaches to Indian affairs. Roosevelt's private conversations with Margaret Rose and Running Bear revealed his genuine interest in expanding Successful models rather than simply maintaining failed policies that served political convenience rather than human welfare. What you have accomplished here challenges every assumption that has guided federal Indian policy for decades, Roosevelt told Margaret Rose during their meeting in the Settlements Council Lodge. Your demonstration that Native communities can modernize without losing their essential character suggests possibilities that my administration should seriously consider implementing elsewhere. Margaret Rose's response drew on 2 decades of experience, balancing Apache values with American political realities, offering insights that reflected both practical wisdom and deep understanding of the cultural forces that shaped policy decisions. In Washington, success requires recognizing that assimilation and preservation are not opposite forces, she explained. Communities can adopt new technologies and economic strategies while maintaining the social relationships and spiritual practices that define their identity. The president's visit generated national media attention that brought the settlements story to audiences throughout the United States and beyond. Newspaper articles and magazine features described Margaret Rose as the woman who bridged 2 worlds, though such characterizations oversimplified the complex process of cultural synthesis that had made the community's achievements possible. Harper's Weekly published a comprehensive feature story that included photographs of the settlement schools, workshops, and ceremonial grounds alongside interviews with community members who described their experiences of maintaining Apache identity while engaging successfully with American economic and political systems. The article's impact extended far beyond simple publicity, influencing public opinion about Native capabilities and the potential for alternative approaches to intercultural relations. The growing national recognition of Margaret Rose's work created opportunities for influencing policy at the highest levels of government, but it also generated pressures and expectations that threatened to overwhelm the carefully maintained balance between public advocacy and community welfare. She found herself increasingly torn between requests for consultation, speaking engagements, and advisory roles that could advance important causes while potentially compromising the time and energy she devoted to local responsibilities. The dilemma was resolved through discussions with Running Bear and other community leaders who recognized that Margaret Rose's external influence served Apache interests while honoring the values that had guided their resistance to assimilation policies. They agreed that she should accept selected opportunities for national advocacy while ensuring that such activities strengthened, rather than weakened, her connections to the settlement and its people. Margaret Rose's testimony before congressional committees investigating Indian policy reforms provided detailed evidence about alternatives to reservation confinement and forced assimilation that had produced measurable improvements in health, education, and economic self-sufficiency. Her presentations were notable for their combination of statistical data and personal narratives that humanized policy discussions, while maintaining focus on practical solutions rather than abstract principles. The question before this committee, she told the House Subcommittee on Indian Affairs during one particularly influential hearing, is not whether Native communities can adapt to modern conditions, but whether American society possesses sufficient wisdom and flexibility to accommodate indigenous approaches to adaptation that preserve cultural diversity while achieving shared goals of prosperity and social stability. The legislation that emerged from these hearings incorporated several of Margaret Rose's recommendations, including provisions for community-controlled education, economic development programs that built on traditional skills and knowledge, and legal protections for ceremonial practices that had been suppressed under previous policies. Though implementation of these reforms faced significant bureaucratic resistance, their inclusion in federal law represented unprecedented recognition of indigenous rights and capabilities. Margaret Rose's involvement in national policy debates also brought her into contact with other reformers who were challenging various forms of social injustice and institutional discrimination. Her correspondence with Jane Addams, the pioneering social worker who had established Hull House in Chicago, explored connections between the settlement movement in urban areas and the community-based approaches that had proven successful in Apache territory. Your work demonstrates that social reform must be rooted in respect for the people being served rather than imposed according to external assumptions about their needs and capabilities. Addams wrote in one of her letters, "The participatory methods you have developed could benefit urban immigrant communities who face similar challenges of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to American economic and political systems." These exchanges led to collaborative projects that applied Apache community organizing principles to address problems in industrial cities, creating networks of mutual support that helped immigrant families navigate complex urban environments while preserving connections to their cultural heritage. The success of these initiatives provided additional evidence that indigenous knowledge systems offered valuable insights for addressing contemporary social problems. Margaret Rose's influence on educational reform extended beyond the specific pedagogical innovations she had developed at the settlement to encompass broader questions about the purposes and methods of American schooling. Her correspondence with John Dewey, the philosopher and education reformer who was developing theories of democratic education, explored the implications of Apache learning traditions for understanding how children develop intellectual and social capabilities. Your observations about the relationship between cultural identity and academic achievement challenge fundamental assumptions about standardization and efficiency that dominate current educational thinking, Dewey wrote in response to one of Margaret Rose's detailed reports about student outcomes. "The individualized approaches you describe suggest that real efficiency requires adapting instruction to students' backgrounds and interests, rather than forcing all children through identical curricula." The educational conferences where Margaret Rose presented her findings attracted audiences of teachers, administrators, and policymakers who were seeking alternatives to the rigid, punitive methods that characterized most American schools. Her demonstrations of Apache teaching techniques generated enthusiasm for reforms that emphasized hands-on learning, cultural relevance, and respect for students' existing knowledge and capabilities. Several progressive schools throughout the United States began implementing modified versions of Margaret Rose's methods, achieving improvements in student engagement and academic performance that validated her arguments about the benefits of culturally responsive pedagogy. These successes created momentum for broader educational reforms that recognized diversity as a resource rather than an obstacle to effective instruction. The economic model that Margaret Rose and Running Bear had developed at the settlement attracted attention from business leaders and economists who were interested in alternatives to the purely extractive approaches that characterized much of American industrial development. Their demonstration that traditional skills and knowledge could generate substantial income while maintaining ecological sustainability offered insights relevant to emerging concerns about resource depletion and environmental degradation. A study conducted by researchers from Harvard Business School documented the settlement's economic strategies in detail, revealing sophisticated approaches to market analysis, product development, and quality control that rivaled those employed by major corporations. The report's conclusions challenged prevailing assumptions about primitive versus advanced economic systems, while highlighting the potential benefits of integrating indigenous knowledge with contemporary business practices. The Apache settlements' success demonstrates that traditional communities possess economic wisdom that modern industries ignore at their own peril, wrote Professor Charles Henderson, the study's lead researcher. Their understanding of sustainable production methods, quality craftsmanship, and long-term resource management offers models that could benefit American business practices while addressing growing concerns about industrial sustainability. These findings influenced the emerging conservation movement as leaders like Gifford Pinchot recognized that indigenous land management practices could inform federal policies for managing national forests and other public resources. Margaret Rose served on several advisory committees that developed guidelines for balancing resource extraction with ecological preservation, drawing on Apache knowledge about maintaining productive landscapes over extended time periods. The personal costs of Margaret Rose's expanding public role became evident as she approached her 50th birthday, when the accumulated stress of managing multiple responsibilities while maintaining her commitments to family and community began affecting her health and emotional well-being. The constant travel required for consultation and advocacy work separated her from the relationships and activities that had sustained her through previous challenges. Running Bear's concern for his wife's welfare led to frank discussions about the sustainability of her current level of activity and the need to establish boundaries that would preserve her capacity for long-term contribution rather than risking burnout that could undermine everything she had worked to achieve. Their conversations reflected the deep partnership that had enabled both of them to balance personal needs with public responsibilities throughout their marriage. Your influence serves not only our people, but many others who benefit from your wisdom and experience, Running Bear acknowledged during one of their private talks. But your first responsibility is to yourself and to us. The work will continue regardless of your individual involvement, but we cannot replace the person you are or the contributions that only you can make to our family and community. The resolution that emerged from these discussions involved a gradual transition of Margaret Rose's national advocacy responsibilities to younger Apache leaders who had been trained in her methods, while maintaining different perspectives and approaches that could advance the same causes. This transition honored her achievements while ensuring continuity of the reform efforts she had initiated. Rosa Elena, now 25 years old and possessing diplomatic skills that equaled or exceeded those of her mother, assumed primary responsibility for representing Apache interests in policy discussions and educational conferences. Her ability to articulate indigenous perspectives while demonstrating mastery of American political and academic protocols made her an effective advocate whose credibility was enhanced rather than diminished by her obvious cultural pride and commitment. David Running Bear had become a respected leader within the settlement, serving as a bridge between traditional elders and younger community members who were navigating the complex challenges of maintaining Apache identity in an increasingly interconnected world. His deep knowledge of ceremonial practices and his ability to explain their contemporary relevance made him invaluable for ensuring cultural continuity across generational transitions. Mikael Swift, Arrow's artistic achievements had gained international recognition, with his paintings and sculptures being exhibited in galleries throughout the United States and Europe. His work demonstrated the creative possibilities that emerged from intercultural dialogue while honoring the spiritual and aesthetic traditions that had shaped Apache artistic expression for centuries. The success of Margaret Rose's children in developing their individual capabilities while maintaining strong connections to their community validated the educational and cultural approaches that had guided the settlement's development. Their achievements provided evidence that cultural mixing could produce positive results when it occurred within supportive environments that encouraged authentic self-expression rather than forced conformity to external standards. Margaret Rose's transition from public advocacy to community-focused leadership allowed her to concentrate on the relationships and activities that had originally drawn her to Apache society. She resumed teaching responsibilities at the settlement school, mentoring young women who were developing leadership capabilities, and participating in ceremonial activities that connected her to the spiritual foundations of Apache culture. Personal satisfaction she derived from returning to these essential activities was enhanced by her recognition that the broader reform movement she had helped initiate was now self-sustaining, carried forward by individuals and organizations throughout the United States who had adopted and adapted her methods to address various forms of social injustice and institutional discrimination. As Margaret Rose entered her 60th year, the settlement she had helped establish had become home to over 500 Apache families representing various bands and tribal groups who had chosen community-controlled development over reservation confinement or urban assimilation. The economic prosperity, educational excellence, and cultural vitality that characterized the community provided ongoing demonstration that indigenous peoples could thrive while maintaining their distinct identities and values. The celebration of Margaret Rose's 60th birthday became an occasion for reflecting on the extraordinary transformation that had carried her from abandonment and despair to influence and fulfillment that exceeded anything she could have imagined during her darkest moments beside that desert boulder 30 years earlier. Community members, former students, and collaborators from throughout the continent gathered to honor her contributions while acknowledging that her greatest achievement had been creating institutions and relationships that would continue serving Apache interests long after her individual involvement had ended. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.